Hello? Anybody home?
Today, I want you to open your mind.
I've almost come to the conclusion that the story is so damning that the mass of people can't deal with it.
We are in process of developing a whole series of techniques to get people actually to love their servitude.
We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
To change the minds and the attitudes and the beliefs of the people to bring about one world socialist totalitarian government.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists.
It has patterned itself after every dictator who has ever planted the ripping imprint of a boot on the pages of history since the beginning of time.
If you can get people to consent to the state of affairs in which they are living, then you have a much more easily controllable society than you would if you were relying wholly on clubs and firing squads and concentration camps.
Tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices.
As you connect the dots between different people, organizations, religions, history, suddenly the picture starts to form.
The kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men.
Someone born in the United States is not more special than someone born in Mexico. They're just vehicles for the consciousness to experience.
They do not want your children to be educated. They do not want you to think too much.
It was learned that the aliens had been and were then manipulating masses of people through secret societies, witchcraft, magic, the occult, and religion.
They reach into our children. Music, television, books.
Prey on children's innocence.
How can I disprove lies that are stamped with an official seal?
So if you have the opportunity to stand next to one of these machines, it feels like an altar to an alien god.
Genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun.
The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc is now in the possession of the Army.
Too many others know what's happening out there, and no government agency has jurisdiction over the truth.
Any state, any entity, any ideology that fails to recognize the worth, the dignity, the rights of man, that state is obsolete. A case to be filed under M for Mankind in the Twilight Zone.
It's about time some of you got acquainted with the real hard truth.
If you don't connect the dots, it's just a mass of what's all this about.
You are listening to the Secret Teachings Radio. I'm your host, Ryan Gable. tspradio.info is the website. rdgable at yahoo.com is the email. Thank you so much for tuning in on this special Friday edition of the show. For the majority of you in the audio-only archive, you should know that there is a video version of this show. It is completely, entirely free. That means there's not even an advertisement placed in it. We don't even take super chats or anything like that on YouTube, so shouldn't be any ads or any kind of financial things floating around the show. It's totally free. Check it out. It is free because of listeners like you who do subscribe, who buy books, and on occasion support us via Cash App or Buy Me a Coffee. Links to that are below in the video show and the audio show. If you're new to this show, I encourage you to pay attention and don't just run it as background noise, especially because you might hear something and you might assume that what you hear is an indicator of what the show's about when you might misunderstand what I'm saying. And I say that because tonight's show, Pogroms Progress USA Edition, is a continuation of a long-standing, I guess it's become a series here on the Secret Teachings. And that series is applying the historical record to what is happening today and watching that historical record rhyme and repeat, producing the conditions today that we've seen historically that lead to things that we have been programmed, I think, quite literally with in movies and in general entertainment and media to believe happened in a certain way or in a unique way, and that nobody can or should. In fact, it's illegal in some places to even question such things. We're seeing this all around the world. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I am talking about what is considered to be a growing tidal wave, perhaps a rogue wave of, quote, anti-Semitism that is being reported in the UK, all across Europe, in Germany. It's being reported in Russia. It's being reported in Asia as a whole. It's being reported specifically in Southeastern Asia, particularly in Thailand. It's being reported in the United States, Mexico, pretty much the entire world. At least those are the optics. And that's where things get controversial and a little bit confusing, because people might have the programmed opinion anti-Semitism is growing. It's a big issue. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I suppose it depends on how you define anti-Semitism. However, it is possible that there isn't actually any growing anti-Semitism, regardless of how you define the term. It might simply just be that the optics of such a thing are being created, and it might just so happen to be that this is precisely what happened in part historically, that things didn't really change historically on the subject of Jews or Semites, that the general public had sort of always viewed Jews and Semites in a certain light, and that light was outsiders who did not want to participate in the general intercourse of society. This goes back to the time of Rome, and even before the time of Rome. This goes back to the first tribes that we look at today and say a bunch of people that are white, that look like they're from Eastern Europe, must be descended from those brown people, because that makes sense. So on the subject of anti-Semitism and on the subject of Israel and Zionism and Jews and all of these things, if you've read the show description tonight, what you'll read is something of a warning. And I've said this many times on the show. I wrote a book about it, as a matter of fact. I said this in the show description. I said the sudden emergence of organic and synthetic resistance to Israel in the United States has spiraled even quicker into repulsion for common Jews, just as this show predicted years ago. You'll know that we predicted that not because I make predictions or that I'm a prophet or something like that, but just because that's what history has shown us. I went on to write in the show description, despite the propaganda machine attempting to dispel rumors of truth by obfuscation and misinformation, and despite many anti-Israel groups being run by Israel, the American public is perhaps just a few years away from proceeding along the lines of 1933 Germany, something it turns out we have also been lied to about. And what I mean by that, if it's not clear, is kind of the opposite of all of the rhetoric and all of the talking points that are very common to hear in conspiracy circles and conspiracy communities and maybe alternative radio shows. People love to use terms, and I used to do it myself because that's what I was programmed with. People used to, and still do, and they love to use terms like Nazi. They like to use terms like, well, that's what the Nazis did. The Nazis censored the media and took control of the press. The Nazis did this, that, and the other thing. Then you read about why the Nazis took control of the press, and it was because the press was primarily run by Jews, and the entertainment industry was primarily run by Jews, not exclusively, but primarily in Weimar Germany. This is statistically verifiable. It's statistically factual. And those people in those positions of power used that power to undermine the German culture, to undermine their values, to undermine the essence or the symbol of what it meant to be German. They were responsible for the pornography, responsible for the transgenderism at Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexual Science, these bizarre sex-themed, drug-fueled orgies that were held at clubs across Germany, specifically in Berlin, that were shut down when the Nazis took power. That's why the Nazis took control of the press and the media. And you might be and you might not be. I don't know who you are and what you believe, but you might be surprised to learn that if you actually were to go read the Holocaust Encyclopedia, it essentially admits that. But it does it in a roundabout way. The Germans just didn't like things that were anti-German. Well, yeah, exactly. Just like Americans don't like things that are anti-American. And when you find out that many of the things that are anti-American are actually produced and pushed by Jews, you'll recognize that we have a very similar problem today in the United States. And as more people begin to recognize this, there is, again, both organic, natural resistance to it, but there's also synthetic resistance where you have the person who's running the city of New York, supposedly, who's a radical Muslim. Turns out he's not actually a radical Muslim. Turns out he is a Shabbat Goy who works for Jews, and that's not a debatable thing. His transition team, pretty much Jewish. His campaign staff were pretty much Jewish. There were a few Muslims, but they were almost primarily Jewish. The first people he met with after he became the mayor were Jews. He had like a celebration with a bunch of head Jewish leaders in New York. It's the same thing with the guy that's running to replace Ron DeSantis in Florida. He's Jewish, but he's campaigning on a policy of anti-Israel. That's the synthetic brand of this. And there's a lot of synthetic versions of it in the media as well, where people think because some people online talk about how they don't like Israel, that they might be trustworthy. And then you find out that they're part of the same club. So we have to differentiate between the organic and the synthetic, and we need to do it very quickly because things are taking a turn for the worse, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And what is happening today worldwide, at least the optics of it, are exactly, and I mean exactly, what had happened in Russia, what had happened in 100+ other countries. And people joke about this. Oh, it's going to be 110. And people just they say those things. It's so anti-Semitic and wrong. Well, here's the thing. That's historical fact. That's the bottom line. And if you ignore that, this is my argument. Personally, this is what I argue. If you ignore that fact, but you want to help protect Jews, you are actually putting Jews in danger. Every common Jew who does not support the state of Israel or the porn industry, maybe conservative Orthodox Jews who also go to jail for the trouble of exercising their free speech rights, even in the United States. Guess who gets wound up and round up? Guess who gets persecuted, perhaps even prosecuted? Guess who gets targeted? Average, everyday Jews. So if you want to save Jews, you need to differentiate between who and what these people and these groups are. And let me give you a good example of why you need to do that. What I am showing you on the screen, for those of you who can't see this, you can look this up. It actually took me some time to find this, considering that I knew exactly what I was looking for, and it took a long time to dig it up. This is from the journal Physics and National Socialism from May 6th of 1947, and this is Max Planck, the scientist, talking about his conversation with Adolf Hitler. And I want you to pay very close attention to this as I read it. Close your eyes, relax for a moment, and just listen to this. Following Hitler's seizure of power, this is Max Planck speaking, had the responsibility as president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society of paying my respects to the Führer. I believed I should take this opportunity to put in a favorable word for my Jewish colleague Fritz Haber, without whose invention of the process for producing ammonia from nitrogen in the air the previous war would have been lost from the start. Hitler answered me with these words, quote, this is Hitler speaking, I have nothing against Jews as such, but Jews are all communists, and it is the latter who are my enemies. It is against them that my fight is directed. Now, this is verifiable fact because these were the people that ran Germany post-World War I further into the ground. These were the people that tried a violent physical uprising in Germany in the early 1920s after they got done with the czars in Russia. And German soldiers were able to stop that uprising. So instead of the physical Bolshevik revolution, they undermined the culture, society, morals, values, economy, etc. So we know that's a historical fact. Hitler was opposed to communists, and most Jews were communists. So when communists were rounded up, when political subversives were rounded up, when people that were engaged in political violence were rounded up, yes, the majority were Jews, because Jews were primarily responsible for the political violence, for the communism, for the acts of terrorism. Planck goes on to say, I commented that there are different types of Jews, both worthy and worthless ones to humanity, with old families of the highest German culture among the former. And when I suggested that a distinction would have to be made between them after all, again, this is Planck speaking, he replied, Hitler said this, that's not right. A Jew is a Jew. All Jews stick together like burrs. Where there is one Jew, all kinds of other Jews gather right away. It would have been the duty of the Jews themselves to draw a dividing line between the various types. They did not do this, and that is why I must act against all Jews equally. Planck responds, he says, he ignored my comment that forcing worthy Jews to immigrate would be equivalent to mutilating ourselves outright because we direly need their scientific work and their efforts would otherwise go primarily to the benefit of foreign countries. Now, that turned out to not actually be accurate because the Germans were incredibly advanced, and many of their advancements have been, I believe, this is my assessment, I believe many of their advancements have been obscured by occult propaganda. Occult propaganda that has suggested that the Nazis were developing all sorts of technologies, talking to aliens, etc., when it was actually the Old Testament Jews who believed that they're talking to something otherworldly. And we see a lot of this happening today with the unfolding of disclosure and the positioning of whatever this alien presence is that we can't actually see with the Old Testament God, which will then, of course, protect Israel in the end times, as so the prophecy, at least one interpretation of prophecy goes. The Old Testament God are the aliens. That's where ancient aliens comes from, and that works to disparage and demean Jesus in the New Testament and Christianity as well. And we know where that comes from, too. So this one statement from Hitler is important. At one point in the past, we used to be able to read this stuff and say, okay, so we know what he said. We can learn from history. Let's not do whatever Hitler supposedly did again. But at some point, we were told we're not even really allowed to read these types of things. In fact, a lot of publishers stopped even printing Mein Kampf. Things like this that should be easy to find. Max Planck, one of the most famous scientists ever, speaking with Adolf Hitler, essentially buried in an obscure physics socialism journal from the 40s. I knew exactly what the quote was, and it took me about 45 minutes to dig this up today. And I don't know, maybe I was just having a bad morning doing research, but it took a while to dig this up. There are a lot of sources that say this is not actually what Hitler said. But no, it is congruent with Mein Kampf, and it is important to understand this one sentence. Of all the rest, it's important, but this one sentence is perhaps the most important. The sentence is, it would have been the duty of the Jews themselves to draw a dividing line between the various types. And he goes on to say they did not do this, and that's why I must act against all Jews equally. This is the problem, ladies and gentlemen. This is the problem. Because to suggest, even as an Orthodox conservative Jew, or even maybe a liberal Jew who has an opinion that is out of the ordinary, that is unorthodox, that is not part of the mainstream talking point, that's just contrary to the narrative, you also are put into the category of being an anti-Semite. They even have a term for it. You're a self-hater. And that term hate gets thrown around like Nazi. That term hate gets thrown around like anti-Semite, and it has essentially no meaning. And this is the problem today, because from tech companies to the media, from Sam Altman, Mark Zuckerberg, and the like, to people like Alex Karp, to people like, well, I could name probably 50 people, but we'll keep it simple. People like Barry Wise and Larry Ellison at CBS. Jews tend to stick together, and it makes sense why they stick together. You're a small group of people. Of course, you're going to stick together with people that are like you. Of course, when you read the so-called Epstein emails, there's quite a bit of discussion in there about how Jews are racially superior to the rest of the human population, and this gives them a right to rule over the rest of the population. They are racially superior. Where have I heard that before? Wasn't that an argument that we've heard for as long as I've been alive? Certainly twice my lifespan and probably more. The argument goes kind of like this. The Nazis believed that they were the master race. The Nazis believed that they were genetically superior to everybody else. They tried to create a master race, and it was all just pseudoscience and nonsense. Well, that's interesting because that is precisely the type of thing that we read in the so-called Epstein papers, the so-called Epstein emails. We read that. We read about Jewish supremacy. We read about how Jews believe they are more than human, or we are less than human, however way you choose to break it down and cut it down. And for those of you who might have a hard time believing what I'm saying, I will show you on the screen now, and I will reference the exact document. This is the Jewish Peggy Siegel, who runs one of the top 12 American marketing firms in the United States. And she says this in her email. This is the email titled Yacht Slut. She asks, is it going to be 100% Jew night? She says that she doesn't want to spend time with people that are non-Jews. And then you read further. There's a whole bunch of these emails. You read further, and they begin talking about how they want to make sure that only a certain group of people with a certain number or percentage of genetics are allowed to be part of the club. This is in the emails. They're in my new book, Protocols of Goyim, if you'd like to read them. Now, this is not the point of the show tonight, but I'm explaining this because what appears to be happening is a projection of all the things that you thought, well, that's Nazi Germany. Well, maybe to some extent it is, but that's also what the Bolsheviks did. That's also what the communists did. The communists who Hitler said were his main enemy. But the problem was that Jews were almost exclusively communist. And so that produced a problem by proxy, if you will. Now let's shift gears and let's look at something that might seem unrelated, but I promise you, if you pay attention, if you look at the details, this is going to get really, really fascinating. This is a show that I did back in February. It's called a Japanese psyop, and it's something I recognized on both American and Japanese X. You can pause the show if you're watching the video and you can read this description, or you can simply go to our Spreaker page and search this particular show, a Japanese psyop. It's back in February of this year, 2026, the 16th. And I talked about how there's all these videos on X about how Japan has banned Islam. There's videos of various things that are related to politics and some things that are not even related to politics. And the videos, of course, they're in Japanese. You can't understand them unless you speak the language. They're being given fake captions or fake headlines. And they say things like Japan bans Muslims, Japan bans mosques, Japan bans Islam. And none of that is true. The thing is, the Muslim population in Japan is very, very small. It's larger than the Jewish population, but it's about 0.3%. The Jewish population is 0.002%. The Christian population is about 1%, roughly. But I was wondering, considering that Islam is such a very small percentage of the population here, By here, I mean in Japan, where I am, for those of you who don't know. Why would there be such a push in English Western social media? I now know the answer to the question that I'm proposing. Why would there be such a push in Western English social media to encourage people to believe that Islam is being targeted in Japan, that Islam is being outlawed in Japan? Where does that come from? And why has there been a push over the last 10 years? I think it has finally sort of died out. The fire was not protected. The fires died out. But it was this argument that some tourists have become upset over the swastika in Japan, or the manji in Japan, which is on maps, it's on signs, it's on temples, because it's one of the oldest symbols in the world. From the whirling log to the manji of Asia, it represents the four elements, the turning of the wheel of the sun, and a whole lot more. But I was wondering, why was there a move to get rid of the swastika? And that plan has been dropped. They're not going to do that, but why has there been a plan to do it? And I started thinking, why has there been a plan to remove the swastika? Why has there been a plan to try to convince Western English-speaking audiences that Japan is banning Islam, that they're banning halal, that they're banning mosques? Why is this happening? Why is there also a push? I've noticed this recently. Why is there also a renewed push to encourage people to believe that Japan has not paid reparations for World War II and they need to pay those reparations today? Does any of this sound familiar to you? Does any of this sound like we've heard this before? A push to ban Islam, targeting of certain symbols like the swastika, whatever it might mean respectively in a country, and the idea that a country needs to pay reparations for their past wrongdoings? Where have we heard this before? We've heard it in America, nonstop. You can't have swastikas. Nazism's a crime, even though it's not a crime. Things like Islam should be banned, the Quran, the mosques, etc. Those Muslims should be deported. Where have we heard all that before? We've heard that in America. We're hearing it right now as I speak. We're hearing these things. So why is that happening in Japan, where the population of Muslims is 0.3%? And I think it's probably lower than that. Genuine Muslims, and by Muslims, most people, I think, usually imply Arabs, and that's not always the case. 1% Christians, a lot of those Christians are just trendy Christians. They become Christian because it's like a cool Western thing, in the same way that a lot of Westerners just become Buddhists because it's like a cool, trendy thing. Of course, there are legitimate Buddhists. I consider myself a legitimate practitioner of Shinto, even though it's not really something to practice. But the point is, 0.3% of the population, and that's what the Western English audiences are being. Why? And then I learned what the reason was. A friend of mine sent this to me this morning, and it was quite a synchronicity, if you will, because this article, I think, sums up why. This article summarizes why these things have been happening, why there is, for English audiences, this sort of pageantry of Islam in Japan, and why is there an attempt to ban the swastika in Japan, and why is there this pushback against people exposing the tengu as this representative of like a rabbinical caricature. And I now have the answer, and it factors into what we were talking about with Max Planck a little bit ago. This is an article, it's an opinion piece, it's a blog written by Melissa Unshiyama. She is a podcast host, a writer, and she hosts and gives tours to Israelis in Japan. Now, let me tell you from firsthand experience living over here. you rarely ever see black people. You rarely ever see most races of people. You usually see a lot of Indians. Usually you see a lot of white tourists from the UK, sometimes Europe. It depends on where you are, but generally speaking, I have never, ever seen a Jew in Japan. And I like when people say, well, how would you even know what a Jew looks like? Isn't that Well, I know what a Muslim looks like because they're usually dressed in the religious garb. I know what an Indian looks like and smells like, unfortunately. I know what, rude Westerners look like. I know what kind Westerners look like. I know what kind decent black people look like. But it's not that common. And I've never seen a Jew anywhere I've traveled in Japan in 2 years. Never. And that would make sense because they comprise about 0.002% of the population. It comes out to be about 1,000 or so people in a country of 120-something million. So what is happening here? Well, let's look at this article. This is a blog post article. Is it just a random thing, or is there something more to this? This writer says the following: Japan may be one of the last ports of freedom for Jews. This is what she's writing. There's no hassle whether they are in kippot or rock the Israeli flag on their mochila. While it's a culture of respecting boundaries and low volume, it's not that speaking Hebrew is a problem. Plus, there's sushi, cameras, vintage shopping, and plentiful nature. The shekel goes far now. There's no tipping culture. Ironically, they think that that's great. And direct round-trip EL/AL flights are increasing from 2 to 4 times each week. Tokyo beckons, and mountains of Wagyu await, which I don't know why they would be celebrating that because I don't think it's kosher. Japan may be the finest, softest landing and playground for Israelis. Even our McDonald's shines. And that's not even talking about the emotional, mental, and physical hiatus they need. Japan offers a hush that every single guest of ours has soaked up. They are calmer here, and they deserve it. They are God's chosen people. People seem happy to line up here. No one cuts. Everyone exists in the train first, or exits the train first, rather. Everyone exits the train first before new people get on. The body relaxes from years of war and tension. Have you picked up yet what's being sold here? Because as soon as I read this, I picked it up almost immediately. It goes on to say, and for as much as this Japan life offers, we are not completely exempt from tension either. They still pass small demonstrations for a free Palestine. For as many of our Israeli guests say they go around freely saying they are Israeli when asked, nobody is asking that. Nobody. It's extremely rude to do a lot of things over here. And one of the rudest would be to go up to somebody and be like, hey, are you a Jew? You just don't talk to people like that here. You might talk about them secretly, like, oh, look, there's a black over there. There's an Indian over there. There's a Chinese over there. That definitely happens. But nobody says, hey, look, I'm going to go ask them if they're a Jew. Total made up nonsense. There are people who sometimes still speak ill and accuse them of everything hateful. And these guests who become our closest friends still have to deal with it here in Tokyo between trips to gardens, jazz bars, and Uniqlo. I'm sure they love Uniqlo because it's like a discount, not discount in the sense that it's like cheap, but like it's a more discounted store for foreigners. Which, hey, I'm all about it too. I am Jewish in that way. I'll take Uniqlo. I'll go to Uniqlo, get some discounted clothes. I like not having to tip, but I understand it's not about really money. It's about the reason behind it. Anyway, I hear their stories as we sit around our table in the evening, sometimes with our mint or yuzu tea, sometimes with sake or nihonshu. They are ready to discuss the war and perception with whoever actually wants to talk and not just bully or call them names. I could read you the rest of this. It's not really necessary. You could go and read it for yourself. But it ends with saying that Japan's a great place for Jews. There's all sorts of amazing things. And it even says this is probably one of the most ridiculous sentences in the whole thing. There are Japanese families who wish to host Israelis and hear their stories. Oh, I'm sure. I am sure that there are Japanese people lined up around. That's what that line was at the mall the other day I saw. It wasn't a line to get gifts or to go to a movie, or it was just people lining up to adopt Jewish families. Now, what I interpret from this is not my opinion. What I interpret from this is what the Israeli National News and what a number of other outlets have published in the last few months to the last few years. Here's the Jerusalem Post saying, following the war, Israel should reduce U.S. dependency and seek alliances in Asia. As the West dies, here's another one. Israel's future lies with rising Asia. It's an opinion piece, sure. The Jerusalem Post is not an opinion piece, but Times of Israel is a blog. You can say, well, what does that matter if some people have those opinions? Well, this is clearly an agenda. The idea is the West is dying, so move to the East, which is ironic because that is also kind of what a parasite does, or a parasitic thing, or parasitic, like, the aliens in Independence Day. They're like a hive that go from one planet to the other, extracting all the resources and leaving utter destruction and death in their wake. And so it's even funnier when you consider it from that point of view, as offensive as you might interpret that point of view to be. That's how the world sees these people. And if you're concerned with me saying these people, you might want to go back to what Max Planck and Hitler were talking about. And that is, well, if they made the distinction between who supports this behavior and who doesn't, then maybe they all wouldn't be grouped in together. But if you go back and look at the article, just the subheader, the Japan I know is a haven from anti-Semitism. Well, here's the thing. I am very, very certain that if Japanese people were exposed in mass to what this term supposedly means and to what the Israelis do and how they act and behave, they've already gotten a flavor, a little taste from tourists who are ranked the worst in the world outside of China. I guarantee you that whatever you call anti-Semitism is going to be exponentially worse in Japan and all of Asia than it ever was in any part of the Western world. And let me explain why that is. Because although there is a lot of propaganda about the East and about Japan in particular, about how they're just so racist, well, not really. They just don't like people behaving in ways that are uncivil. And I can tell you this, if you bring a bunch of Jews here and they act in Japan like they act in Thailand, where they've enacted policies at the governmental level that have said specifically to Jews, but generally to everybody, if you're going to come to Thailand, you need to act like an adult. You need to act like a human being, not an animal. You don't deserve anything from anybody. Nobody owes you something. You don't get free stuff. You don't get to engage in crimes and steal things and just there's no consequences. That's what's happening in Thailand because of Jewish tourists. And that's not my opinion either. And it's not just in Thailand. Here's an Australian Jewish independent newspaper talking specifically about how these people act from Cyprus to Turkey, through Thailand, Peru, the UK, India, and other destinations, which is really wild. If you go to India and you find a way to insult the Indians, to be dirtier and to be louder and to be more rude than the Indians, that's all that you need to know. Jews are ranked the 5th in most, according to this article, travel polls, worst tourists in the world. If you look them up independently, you'll find that Chinese and Jewish or Israeli tourists are the top 2 in I think, on average, consistently in polls. This particular article ranks them as the 5th. Even then, that's a very, very hard number to come by, considering how few Israelis there actually are in the world and how few of them actually travel to these countries. Maybe not so much Turkey, or places like Thailand or Peru. Well, maybe not so much Peru, but maybe India. And here's the article stating the following. Some hotels have an unofficial policy of refusing young Israeli tourists while words such as shameless, undisciplined, noisy, and demanding, those all describe Chinese tourists on average too, are said to be the most common when describing travelers from the Jewish state. Luxury car rental companies also suffer from Israeli mayhem. Felipe Sarfati, director of the online travel agency Book Now, said one of my clients crashed a Bentley against a pole. He was driving at 150 miles, or rather kilometers per hour, 93 miles per hour, in the middle of town. It was only 2 years ago when the Abraham Accords normalized relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. At the time, Israel's foreign ministry was informing future tourists of good practices in the Muslim country with strict rules. Then the first Tel Aviv-Dubai flights began. Israeli Gil Gurevich, who owns a kosher restaurant in Dubai, extensively documents on his Instagram account the excesses of his compatriots in the flagship tourist city of the Emirates. He reports, among other things, that this is a Jew saying this, that their poor behavior in nightclubs or in shopping centers attracts a good number of fines. And what about those that steal towels, hangers, kettles, or even lamps from their hotel room? This is a Jew saying this in a Jewish newspaper. Stories of this type are legion in the UAE, but not only in the Gulf state. Wherever the Israeli tourist goes, the rules take a vacation. Israelis have a certain natural nerve, the chutzpah, which stands out even more when they are abroad because it is a way of being that often clashes with local norms, notes Danielle, 30 years old from Israel. This is another Jew acknowledging this, who sometimes conceals her nationality when she travels. Pretty good idea. Also, for the record, Jews are not the only ones that conceal their identity. Honestly, I would conceal my identity. I wouldn't want to be considered an American in a lot of places for the same reason that Jews don't want to be considered Jews in a lot of places, because those places know what Jews and Americans have done to them, and so that they're not very excited when they see Jews and Americans walking around. She says, I was recently in Italy, and one day I saw a group of Israelis arrive at the hotel where I was staying. By the time they gave them their rooms, they made a mess at the reception. The mothers were changing their babies on the armchairs while the fathers were shouting at the older children who were running around. It was nonsense. Going back to Felipe Sarfati, I read that story about the Jew that crashed the Bentley. He went back to the guy and just said, well, it's not my problem, it's your problem. Again, these are Jews saying this is how Jews act in a Jewish newspaper. This is the case in the UK, South America, the Middle East, and Asia. So as the West dies, Israel's future lies with rising Asia. Following the war, after the Americans have been drained of all of their blood and all of their resources and all of their wealth and all of their morals and values, Israel should reduce U.S. dependency and seek alliance in Asia. That is what the aliens from Independence Day did, isn't it? And then here is an Israeli, Jewish, Japanese woman who says that she gives tours. This is recent, by the way. This is February of this year. She gives tours to Israelis, to Jews. And they love Israel because, excuse me, that's a Freudian slip. And they love Japan because it's peaceful here. Which is kind of tone deaf because, as most people would tell you, personally, I haven't experienced this. I think I'm just a really weird person, different person. But most people will tell you, of course, if you come here, it's going to be peaceful and you're not going to have many problems. But if you moved here and you lived here permanently, things are going to get a little different because they're going to expect you to learn the customs and to learn the language. And you will get viciously, passively trolled and shamed if you don't follow those kinds of rules. How do you think Jews and Israelis are going to react to that? What's the plan? Is it to deport them all from the United States and send them to Japan? I mean, Japan barely has immigrants from compatible countries, from countries that are closer in genetic relation. This country probably has the strictest immigration, and they're making them stricter immigration policies in the world. They're even changing them for people that have had residency in the country long term. They're changing them and just saying, look, if you lived here for 9 years and next year you get your permanent residency, guess what? Or it's 4 years and you get your permanent residency next year. Guess what? We doubled it. Good luck. You got another 6 years. It's really strict. What are they going to do? They're just going to bring a bunch of Jews here after they get kicked out of every Western country? That's what this article is implying. that in the future, Japan is like a safe haven for Jews. Isn't that weird? It's particularly weird because I want to show you a couple of these things from my new book, Protocols of Goyim, that might help you to understand this in a little bit more detail, because it can be a very complex and confusing thing. I have to understand that most folks are not aware of this, or you're learning about this for the first time. So let me share something with you here so that you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. First thing is some of the propaganda that I was mentioning to you. Why is there this pageantry about Islam in Japan being banned? Why is there an attempt to ban the swastika? Why are these social media accounts pushing this stuff about Tengu? Well, here's one that I follow just because there's sometimes Japanese news, but it's basically like a right-wing Western account. And it says the number of mosques in Japan is completely unacceptable with the Japanese flag. If there are 0 Shinto shrines in the Islamic world, why should we allow a single mosque here? I mean, yeah, sure, it's a fair question. But see, here's the problem. This account publishes a tremendous amount of disinformation and propaganda. And it's mostly right-wing, Christian, radical, Jewish, Israeli, American White House propaganda. This is the same kind of thing that you see in like Texas. This is the same kind of thing you see in like Western American media. Why are there so many mosques? Why is it happening in Japan, where literally these people comprise less than, for Muslims, less than 0.5% of the population? And of those, only a percentage of them are, quote, Arabs. Some of them are just converts. They're from Asia. So what is that? What am I looking at here? I'm looking at Israeli propaganda paving the way before it ever gets started, before Islam ever became or becomes somewhat popular because of free speech and free press and free religion and all of that in the United States, where Islam was able to flourish with other religions, like Judaism was allowed to flourish. Now they're trying to shut down Islam in the US, and they're extending this to Japan for several reasons. One, because Japan brings in a tremendous amount of Western media and propaganda, and things that are Western are very trendy. And they're, I think, trying to condition people to this idea before there's even enough Muslims in the country to quite frankly, fill a stadium, fill an arena. This is Israeli propaganda. Here's another example, as I was pointing out earlier. A supposed Japanese person. I am a Japanese person who loves Japan. Halal food is prohibited. That's not true. I'm not Japanese. I love Japan. I've been to several restaurants that offer halal food. Mosques continue to increase. Sure, if you consider the building of 1 or 2 mosques in the last 20 years an increase, then sure, yes. Calls to prayer are prohibited. Well, that's kind of misleading, because there really aren't a lot of Muslims in the government or in the country, and there really aren't a lot of discussions about it. They're discussing issues that are related to Japan, not to Islam, not to Israel. And any kind of public disturbance like this would be inappropriate. Playing music too loud would be inappropriate. If you wanted to have a gathering, you better get the right paperwork. And the police are going to make sure it's a very organized, straightforward, and very clean gathering. If you don't do that, you just go sit down the street. I don't care if you're praying or you're playing a Game Boy, you're probably going to be arrested. Or at least you're going to be removed. So calls to prayer are prohibited. This is like Anthony Bourdain going to Tehran. And a few people that I saw had commented on that video, the one that I could watch overseas because it was removed from a lot of Western platforms. Some people still found it, the Tehran episode. But a lot of people were saying, see, look, they banned Anthony Bourdain from filming at one of the holy sites. It's like, well, yeah, because it's a holy site. You also can't walk into a temple in Japan, or anywhere in Asia for that matter, especially Japan. If you go, actually, you know what? I'm not encouraging a specific person to do this at a specific place, but go ahead and try it sarcastically. Put your shoes on or leave them on, run into a temple and start screaming and shouting. And let's count how long it takes for you to be on the ground with your face in a tatami mat with handcuffs on. They're not going to tolerate it. It has nothing to do with Islam. It's about order in society. Burqas are not prohibited. I think they meant to say are prohibited, not are not prohibited. Maybe I misunderstand that one. Halal mosques call to prayer. Japan's new anti-Islamic law sparks controversy. Maybe I misunderstood this entire post. I might have misunderstood this. I guess she's saying what I'm saying. That's my bad, folks. I misunderstood what this woman was saying. She's actually saying what I'm saying. None of this is true. Okay, good for her. That's my mistake. I rarely make a mistake like that, but I made a mistake right here on air. That's my bad. She's saying what I'm saying. Here's the original post. I think that's why I got confused. I took a whole screenshot of this thing. Japan's new anti-Islamic law sparks controversy. That's not an Islamic law. They're dissolving parliament for an election in that image. This is a real image, a real video of a group of people marching recently. I actually don't know what it was about. Maybe it was about Islam. But regardless of what it was about, there's a lot of posts like this, and they say things like Japanese are protesting against Islam. It's happening all the time in Tokyo. I've never seen it happen. And here's some of that war propaganda. Chinese baby, this is a very famous photograph. A Chinese baby cries as he burns after a firebombing by Japan, the Battle of Shanghai in 1937. Here's another one. Japan, World War II crimes. Japan often paints its invasion of Asia as beneficial and a liberation of Asia from Western interference. Victims were buried alive by Japan. There's a lot of this because of Chinese propaganda. There's a ton of that. But some of this is because of Israeli Western propaganda. That's why it's all in English, because it's not meant for a Japanese audience. Although in some cases, like this Japanese woman, there is the translation feature, which allows you to translate the language, which is why I'm pretty sure X cut off the Hebrew translation because of what the Jews were saying online. And there's Japanese commentators that want the Japanese one removed too, because the Japanese are being shown to be incredibly racist and incredibly discriminatory. But they have a right to do that. They have a reason to do that. And that's obviously not representative of the whole country either. Here's another one. This one was pretty famous. Japan rejects the construction of Muslim cemeteries. I don't follow Japanese politics, but I know who this woman is. And she is part of a small party. And she was expressing her opinion. And she does not represent the whole government, nor does she represent even a significant portion of the government. And then I noticed something else here. This is just a weird one for me. This is like this must be like some kind of pop group or something. This particular post, I've seen a bunch of these. And the reason that this one interested me was because I've heard Americans make this argument to me. So I'm like, this has got to be some kind of talking point. It kind of goes like this. It says, I won't read you the whole thing. So this is, well, actually, I don't really need to read you the post at all. But basically, this is the idea that because the women in Japan look younger, people that are attracted to them are pedophiles. Now, this only made me pay attention to it because someone said that to me one time. Like an American said that to me. Oh, you just like those women because they look like kids. You're a pedophile. And I'd never heard someone say something like that before. And so I started getting these things about anime sent to me. I know some of you probably sent this stuff to me as well about how anime promotes like pedophilia or something. And it's about as out of context as like why there's like tentacle pornography. It's different culture. There's a reason that's well known for why tentacle pornography became popular because of the censorship rules in Japan. And this person that said that to me about women, I said, well, they just look young because like they're young. Like 40-year-olds sometimes look like they're 25 or 30. But when I thought about it, I realized, I think this is part of the same propaganda we're seeing about how Japan needs to play around with, like the idea of reparations for the Chinese or for some other group, the Koreans too. Japan is banning Islam, banning mosques, banning halal, etc. None of that's true, as this Japanese lady points out. None of that's accurate. And Japan promotes pornography and pedophilia and all that with anime, and anime should be banned. The thing is, anime, I want to play you something because I don't know much about anime. I don't really watch anime. I've watched Dragon Ball Z when I was a kid. I started watching Pokemon again, the Japanese Pokemon, in Japanese to practice. I've watched, my wife and I watched Doraemon, one of the Doraemon movies from the 70s the other day. So I don't really watch a lot of anime, but I saw this, I think this guy's Korean, and I wanted to play this for you because this all plays into the whole thing tonight. This guy explains why anime is so popular and why it's so successful globally, anywhere you go in the world.
Here's the thing that a lot of right-wingers still need to understand about anime is that it is not a genre, it's a medium, right? So within anime, you're going to have fantasy, you're going to have sci-fi, you're going to have horror, you're going to have more inappropriate things. But I think conservatives and right-wingers, they need to understand why everyone likes anime so much these days. Not all anime is good. There's some anime that sucks. But a lot of anime, especially the best ones, have tales of heroism, of courage, of virtue, of honor, of loyalty, and all these things that are so near and dear to every single one of us. Because these are virtues that, as Christian, I believe that the law of God is written on our hearts. And so these themes of loyalty, of honor, of virtue, of courage, all these things are things that really motivate and galvanize us. And so they're one of my favorite animes. This is really popular these days, called Frieren, Beyond Journey's End. And there's a character in it called Himmel the hero. He is such a great character. It's not like one of those things where it's like moral ambiguity. He is someone who wants to help people. And he's a funny guy while he does it. But his character literally has real world impact, where there are people who put out mall fires, who stop stabbings on subways because they're motivated by Himmel the hero. And when they ask why they did what they did, they quote him, they'll quote characters in the anime saying, this is what Himmel the hero would do.
I know that anime is because I see it pop up on my video feed all the time. I never had watched it. I had no idea that there are more than a handful of stories where people have done things like put out fires or saved people on subways because of some anime that they had watched. See, that's why anime is being targeted. That's the reason. That's why they're saying anime promotes pornography and pedophilia, when Japan has less of that than the United States, less of that than Israel. I've started to think, well, we've got something that is solid here. And that thing that we have that's solid is proof of a target being painted, as I see in the chat room, a target being painted on Japan. They are a target for multiculturalism. They are a target for a new form of pornography, a new form of social justice. That's where all of this stuff is coming from. Got to ban anime because it's inappropriate. And what are they going to replace that with? What are they going to replace anime with? See, this is like a bigger issue than just a couple of people that like cartoons. Anime is such a big issue that even the prime minister has spoken out against any kind of potential censorship. I would assume many prime ministers have spoken out, like the whole government. Like the government watches anime. I think the prime minister was quoting an anime show the other day. It's big here. And there's pushes to ban it in the Western world. Why? Especially from people that are coming from a country that has the #1 percentile of pedophiles in the world. And I actually saw some Japanese commentators mention that, and they said, well, the people that want to ban this are they're like Americans and Israelis that live in countries that literally are run by pedophiles. Why would they want to ban anime for suggestive content? Especially when these people produce all the porn in the West for the most part, at least the most pervasive forms and most pervert forms. Look at this story here. This is the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE HSI and the U.S. Marshal Service arrested Yechiel Yeshua, Farkash, a foreign fugitive from Israel who was wanted in his home nation for alleged sex crimes against children. Our team arrested him at his home in Lakewood, New Jersey. Now, I've seen Trump supporters using this as an example to say, look, Trump doesn't just do whatever Jews tell him to do. Trump's really enforcing the law here, and we don't let anybody get over. Yeah, okay. So what are they going to do? They're going to send this guy to Israel, where he's just, even though they claim that he's wanted in Israel for sex crimes, they forgive all that in Israel. So ICE arrests a Jewish guy, they bring him to Israel. I was suspecting that maybe what happened was this guy was guilty of the same thing here. They arrested him, deported him, or they're going to deport him back to Israel so he can be forgiven of his crimes like Jonathan Pollard. The country that is responsible for the worst crimes committed against children, sexual crimes against children, wants to ban anime. Why? Well, as some of you are discussing in the chat, it's because those Jungian archetypes, inspiration, things that actually encourage hyper-masculinity and hyper-femininity, those things are present in anime. And that's part of the overall list of things that we have here, like English audiences being shown that Islam is banned in Japan. It's not. The attempt to ban swastikas, which is certainly about a lot more than just Israel, but the attempt to ban swastikas, this addressing of how the tengu is not really a Jewish symbol, which, I mean, I don't think it is, but it's very maybe coincidental, and anime, among other things. And then now I can show you some really important pieces of information. This is from my new book. You can also find these independently online. And what these things are here that I'm going to show you are about as official as you can get. This is the IOM. I can pull this up on the screen for you. This is the IOM, UN Immigration. From crisis response to socioeconomic resilience, Japan is redefining global migration leadership, says IOM chief. And there she is, Director General of the International Organization for Immigration, the IOM, Amy Pope. You may know that name. Keep that name in mind. Here's Japan Intercultural, Rochelle Cope, a Jewish managing principal who attempts to encourage Japan and Japanese companies to adopt multiculturalism. There's a bunch of stories like this. Here's Noah Smith, Jewish journalist, who says Japan needs to welcome immigrants. Here are interviews on the UN's website with Amy Pope. She talks about how she grew up in a Christian household. She moved into a Jewish community. And look at her neighbor. Her neighbor was a Holocaust survivor, it says. And that is what is encouraging Amy Pope to bring Africans to Japan. Christian doing the work of Jews inspired by the Holocaust. In her own words, literally on the UN website. And Rochelle Cope, a Jew pushing multiculturalism. Here's Jewish journalists pushing the same. Here's the Hebrew HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, praising Amy Pope. This is the one that runs the illegals into South America and North America and Europe. This is the group responsible for the overrunning of parts of the UK and parts of Europe and parts of the United States with people that are just outright incompatible, the worst of the worst from the worst of the worst places in the world, that are sent into communities to cause disharmony. That's where you get the hatchet attacks or the knife attacks. That's where you get the machete attacks, the rape in the street, the nudity, the open defecation. And then they try to blame that and say that's because of Muslims and Islam. No. It's because of HIAS. It's because of people like Noah Smith. It's because of people like Rochelle Cope. It's because of people like Amy Pope. And of course, I should remind you of Rahm Emanuel, who was the ambassador to Japan. As an ambassador, he pushed under Shinzo Abe for homosexuality and transgenderism. He has been pushing, when he was the ambassador, for Japan to accept LGBTQ across the board. It didn't do so well. And after years and years of Muslims trying to spread Islam, Islam didn't do so well here either. After centuries of Christianity trying to spread here, 1%. And 1% of that isn't even really Christian. So if Jews wish to colonize Japan, I feel like they're going to have a really hard time. I feel like it's not going to go so well if Jews want to colonize Japan. Why would that be a discussion in Israeli newspapers? Why are Israeli newspapers saying things like we need to go to the east? They just opened up a Holocaust museum in South Korea. Did you know that? Of course, it was a Christian Zionist group who opened up the Holocaust Museum to encourage people to let the Jews take over what they don't already control in South Korea. And no matter what you say, no matter how much you try to put this into a neutral, good faith light, people still define it as hatred. People still define it as bigotry. People still define it because they've been programmed to define it in those ways, in ways that are downright dumb. No critical thought, no context, no perspective. And that's part of why this problem exists. And by the time the public recognizes what I'm about to show you now, it's too late. And when it's too late, there's two ways it can go. There can be synthetic uprisings against it, which are really part of the occupation, let's call it. Or there can be organic ones, which are not controlled by reason and which lead to people obtaining power and doing really bad things. And that's where we are as Americans. And that's what all this propaganda recently has been about on social media and all over the news about anti-Semitism. I took screenshots of dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of this propaganda from Israeli sources all over my social media. The first one I want to show you is in New York. This is supposed to be the Muslim-run New York. These are billboards all over Times Square. Israel strong, united Israel, Israeli flags, Israel. That is a sign that New York is occupied. This is a sign that our country is occupied. That's in New York, but they're run by Muslims in New York. I'm going to show you all of these other images that I took screenshots of, but I wanted to go to the chat just for a moment and acknowledge some of the listeners in there who have been saying things. For example, Tim Curley just said, Rahm Emanuel didn't have much luck with Western narratives in Japan. Precisely my point. You won't have much luck with that racism crap over here. You won't have much luck with it, whether it's for blacks, especially probably for blacks. You won't have much luck with it for any group of people. You're not going to have much luck with it for Jews, primarily because nobody cares about Jews in Japan. The only people that might care are a handful of bigoted Christians, and that's about it. And that's really all that those churches probably even teach over here, because that's all the Western ones teach. For the most part, they just teach that Israel's great, and it's not even about God or getting close to the divine. It's just about Israel, 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 Israel. You know how many people I've talked to over here that don't even know what the Ark of the Covenant is? They don't know who Abraham is. It isn't going to go so well here. Short of another world war, it's not going to work. Why would the Jews be interested in Japan in the first place? I was thinking about that. Why? Probably because they're known as the hardest workers in the world, and they save a lot of money. Even though Japan has the most debt in the world, it's all localized. And they also hold the most U.S. debt. And I think Jews want to get control of that. And Jews want to do to the Japanese what the Japanese planned to do to the Jews in World War II, and that was the Fugu plan. That was basically enslaving Jews to force them to make money for them. That's what they made the Jews do. Not like hard labor, but like get in the accounting books and find us money that we missed. That was literally the Japanese plan. And I think that's what the Jews want to do to Japan. I think that they want to leave the West. They want to embed themselves here, bring in, for some reason, this weird fetish they have for blacks, bring in as many blacks, as many Indians as we can. Let's start putting that in Japanese porn. Let's just make all the male actors black guys. I can tell you that ain't going to go well either. And let's make all these feminine women, let's make them super, super feminist. Unfortunately, Japan is actually pretty ripe for that, considering the dating and marriage problems here. You know who wrote the modern feminist doctrine for Japan, for the record, by the way? Beat Siorta Gordon, a Russian Jew who grew up in Tokyo. At 22 years old, she was recruited to be an interpreter for General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan. And because she spoke Japanese, she is considered one of the primary reasons why Article 14 was written. A Jewish definition of gender equality was written into the Japanese Constitution. We know that Jewish bankers undermined the Japanese economy in the 70s and 80s. Who are they? I could name them for you. Paul Volcker would be one of them, who served for 8 years at the Fed. He ran, I think he might have served for longer than that. I think it was at least 8 years. Who else ran the Fed? I believe it was Arthur Burns and William Miller, or G. William Miller. Miller served for just over a year, whereas Burns and Volcker ran the system and implemented its policies for over a decade and a half. Burns and Volcker were both Jewish. Jews undermined the Japanese economy because it was doing too well without their influence and power. Jews were also responsible in large part for the atomic bomb. And who do you think that the Jews chose to drop that bomb on? Not just Japanese people, Christians. Did you know that? Not only Christians, the Christian city of Nagasaki, they specifically detonated it over the Urakami Valley, which was home to the majority of Christians. I want that to be made real clear. I heard Tucker Carlson mention this the other day, and I thought, is Tucker listening to this show? Because I've literally never heard anybody, even like fringe historians, mention this. Jews were primarily responsible, this goes back to Max Planck, primarily responsible for the atomic bomb program, the Manhattan Project. If they weren't Jews involved in it, they were married to Jews. Jews were also at the table as experts to tell the president what Japanese cities should be bombed. Do you know what those Jews at the White House selected, or in their meetings? What they selected, wherever they held those meetings? They selected Nagasaki, not because it was a military target. They selected Nagasaki because it was the home of Christianity in not just Japan, but the entire Eastern world. And then they specifically tried to target the specific area where most of those Christians lived. They made literally the hub of Christianity in the Eastern world, and not just the hub generally, but the specific pinpoint on a map locally where the Christians were living. They made that the hypocenter of the explosion. Let that sink in for a moment. Jews targeted Christians in Japan. Jews undermined from the central banks in the West. This is well documented and well known, for the record, by the way. Destroyed and undermined the Japanese economic boom. Really Japan should be running the global economy, it would be a much better place. In fact, if Japan and Germany had won World War II, the world would be a much better place. Let's just go ahead and say it out in the open. That doesn't make them good people per se, but the world would be a much better place. People would probably be far healthier. There'd probably be more jobs. People would be paid more. There'd be more pride in society. There'd be more of a distinction between certain lines in society that you don't cross. I think the world would be a much better place if Germany and Japan and Italy, too, had won the war. And not the United States allowing the Soviet Union to gestate into what it was and what it became. And then, of course, China as well. Because the revolution there wasn't just a happenstance. It was planned. And Jews were also responsible for undermining what is considered to be the cultural gender sex norms of Japan. That's why Rochelle Cope and Amy Pope, that's why Rahm Emanuel, that's why Jews and Shabbat Goya, they're obsessed with Japan. I say try it, honestly, because it's not going to go very well. It just doesn't click here because there's not that, you have to have that built-in programming. That built-in program of like Abraham, the Ten Commandments, the Ark of the Covenant, Jesus on a cross. Nobody cares about that here. So you're going to have to brainwash generations of people with Christianity first so that you can undermine their Christian beliefs, and then you can drive Holocaust museums into the country, and then you can force people, under law, of course, to not say certain things. And then by that point, in maybe 50 years, 60 years, maybe, things over here will be like they are in the United States, but you're never going to get to that point. I don't think in any Asian country. And if you think Japan's bad, take a look at China. You think just racism in general is bad in America? You think racism is bad because like somebody like myself, like I personally don't want to walk into a 7-Eleven at 10 o'clock at night if there's a bunch of black guys or really a bunch of anybody hanging outside of the front of that store? White, black, Hispanic, I don't really care. I don't trust them. You ain't seen nothing. Get on a plane, go just anywhere in Asia. Ask about black folks. Ask the Chinese about black folks. They are probably the most racist people on the planet. Like they might be the most, if there's other civilizations, I think the Chinese might be the most racist. We don't have the data for it, but they might be the most racist of anybody in the galaxy. They are horribly racist, like to the point where I'm like, wow, that's actually really racist. And I don't really believe in racism in those ways because racism is you define the term, racism is a preconceived belief, and it's a prejudice, and it's like a phobia where it's like an irrational fear of something. And I don't have an irrational fear of Chinese. I just think that most of the time they're dirty and loud and rude. Same reason that I typically don't like to be around Jews, because they're dirty and they're rude and they're loud. And that's not even me. That's just like what most tourists and most countries say in surveys. It's the Chinese and the Jews who are the worst tourists. They steal, they're loud, they're rude, they're like inconsiderate, they shove people. So I don't think it's going to work out very well over here. Let's go back to these posts that I keep seeing. I took some screenshots of. Here's the Times of Israel. Anti-Semitic incidents in Canada reached a record high in 2025. We're going to define what these things mean in a second. Oh, and by the way, I just saw this pop up in the chat. I must address this. Leonard in the chat says, Chinese are Jews. That's really interesting that you say that, because there is some propaganda as well about how the Japanese are actually Jews. And I'm wondering if that's because there maybe isn't a link between like Chinese or like something about the culture that when you don't have it, it deteriorates to a certain point, kind of like India. I wonder if it's the same thing. Like, I wonder if there is a connection between that. Not that they are Jews, but I wonder if there's a connection between it, because Chinese history and culture is beautiful and vast and elegant. And after communism took over, maybe the best way to say it was communist Chinese are kind of like Jews, because that's how they act and behave. So do the Indians. Maybe that's why, and maybe that's how they force the blacks to act, by giving them a fake identity. maybe that's why the Jews like these people, because they can put them at the forefront of society to make it appear as if all the smells and all the rude behavior and all the crime is being committed by those blacks and those Indians. And then you can make white people hate those people. And then the Jews can just integrate themselves into the quote white population and pretend like, oh, we agree with you. These blacks and Indians are terrible. But yeah, see, you brought them here because they behave the way that you do. And then they take the fall for your behavior. That's kind of how I interpret that. But that's an interesting little thing you bring up there, because that is kind of how they act. A friend of mine calls the Chinese the Ins of Asia, for whatever that's worth. Let's go back to these posts. Anti-Semitic incidents in Canada reached record high in 2025. Now, the point of what I'm getting at here is when you read all these, you're like, oh, well, look, there's all this proof of anti-Semitism. Of course, if you define what the word means, it's proof of just stuff that people say and do that Jews don't like. Here's another one. U.S. Army soldier arrested for threatening to walk into a synagogue with my AK and kill every single Jew. I wonder if that's true. I wonder if or how fabricated that story is. I'll show you why in a second. Here's another one. Jewish leaders demand action after German synagogue is defaced with swastika and kill all Jews graffiti. I've never spoken to a single person ever who thinks the way that I do, who has ever thought, let's kill all the Jews, ever. The only time I've ever heard anybody say that are Jews. The only time I've ever seen anybody paint a swastika on something are Jews. The fake hate crimes, and so on and so forth. Here's another one. Germany is facing a major outrage after a synagogue was vandalized with a swastika. It's the same article. This is the image of it. Gives more details. Police said that Katba Synagogue was defaced before dawn, marking the second attack on the Jewish house of worship in just 4 days. Authorities said the swastika was difficult to remove and opened an investigation immediately. There were other anti-Semitic slogans sprayed in the area. Now, this is in Germany, where all this stuff is like actually really illegal, like to even have a swastika. Here's another one. Brooklyn, New York. This is from Combat Anti-Semitism. Jewish supremacism is a problem. Cheered at Park Slope Co-op meeting. At a Park Slope Co-op or food co-op meeting, a Zoom speaker said Jewish supremacism is a problem and compared Jews to Nazis. At least 50 people attending in person, applauded. Oh my God. In 2024, members pushed to remove Israeli products from shelves. That is important because this is precisely what happened in Germany in 1933. And it's not important because, oh my God, it's happening again. They're going to be holocausted, 6 million of them. No, what I mean by it's happening again is you're now getting to see what led to all the things that we've been lied to about. You're now getting to see why people wanted to ban Jewish products and why they chose to boycott Jewish products and Jewish shops. Because collectively, they did not distinguish themselves. They were part, it was assumed, of the general malfeasance in society, from the porn to the media to the politics to the economics. And so they were targeted by Germans who had had enough of it. You look at our government today, our government is on the side of Israel, on both sides of Israel. It's the people that say, you know what, we don't want to carry Israeli products anymore. We don't want to support Israel. We don't, I mean, really just Jewish supremacism is the problem. I can't say that. I can't say Jewish supremacism is a problem. I've been told my whole life white supremacy is a problem. Why can't I say Jewish supremacy is a problem? Therein lies another part of this issue. Here's Peruvian president. Peruvian president claims Jews controlled banks and pushed Germany into war. Oh, look, the Peruvian president read history books. Here's the Telegraph. Jew hate out of control in UK. Oh, did you see the video of Nick Fuentes pushing and pepper spraying the Jewish woman outside of his home? Did you see that? Get a real good look at it. He pepper sprays her. You know how this story was discussed and how it was painted? Innocent Jew attacked by white supremacist. It's begun. Again, when we see this in real time and we learn what it is and what's begun, we realize, wait a minute. So you're telling me that some woman who potentially was crazy, anybody who gets someone's address and goes to their home like this is probably unstable. You have no idea, male or female, what this person is capable of, if they're armed, etc. They come to your door, especially after having people dox you and having people threaten to kill you. And then they come to your door and you don't even know what this person said. They could have said, "You're Nick Fuentes, I'm going to kill you." So he pepper sprays her and shoves her. He was a lot kinder to her than what I would have done. Girl, boy, I don't care who they were. I would have opened fire on them. You're on my property. You're at my door threatening me. You are trying to push your way into my place. Bang, 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 bang. 6 million shots. Fuck you. I don't care if they're a Jew, a Muslim. I don't care if they're black. I don't care if they're white. You threaten me in my home. I'm standing my ground, and I'm putting 5, 6 bullets in you, however many are in my revolver. That's what I had at the time. Well, I had a bunch of guns, but that was the gun I had at the time. That's what I would do. Of course, that just goes over people's heads. Ryan says he's going to kill Jews. No, what I said is if someone breaks into my house, I'm going to shoot them until they're dead. That's what I said. Nick Fuentes pepper sprays her and shoves her, and it's an attack on Jews. So a crazy Jewish lady gets doxed information, goes to a guy's house, a guy who people have threatened to murder and who doxed him to get him killed, goes to his house, and then he pepper sprays her and shoves her, and that's an act of violence against Jews? See, maybe we need to rethink what, quote, acts of violence against Jews actually were in Germany in the 1930s. And we'll look at that here in a moment. Here's some more of these. There's a whole bunch of them. 2 visibly Jewish men were stabbed in Golders Green, one of Britain's most recognizable Jewish neighborhoods. Makes me think of the Jewish guy who lit the synagogue on fire and claimed it was anti-Semitism, but he lit his own synagogue on fire. Or it reminds me of the guy who, or the girl, there's been a bunch of them, they draw swastikas on things and say, look, we're being attacked because we're Jews. I think one guy actually stabbed himself and claimed it was because he was a Jew. Turns out he stabbed himself. Here's another one. Protesters scream revolting anti-Israel slurs at diners outside New York City Jewish restaurant. Call to bomb Israel. Well, yeah, at this point, that is really the only solution to this problem. Decoupling from Israel means leveling their government institutions, removing their leadership. And if we want to do a regime change, let's get Lockheed Martin on the phone. Let's get Raytheon. Let's do it in Israel. I'm all for a regime change in Israel. That's the only way this problem gets fixed. A regime change, uprooting it from the source and getting rid of all of these parasites. That's the solution to the problem. That's the only solution. That's the finalist solution that the general public is also going to come to. That's my point tonight. Here's another one. It was shocking. This is from the co-op that I mentioned a moment ago. It was shocking. One longtime co-op member told the Post, "That's not who we are." And what exactly was shocking? What exactly happened? I don't remember. Someone said Jewish supremacy is a problem. Oh, that was shocking. That's really not that shocking. Here's the Telegraph article about the Jews. I'm not Jewish, but these are our people in our streets in the city in which I live. Today's attack is utterly shaming and enraging. Look at this. These are the people in London that we are supposed to believe are Middle Eastern. Look at these people. These are not, this guy has red hair. Jesus might have had red hair, but I don't think Jesus had white skin. Look at this guy. This guy looks like he's from Eastern Europe. These are not people from the Middle East. Why did they get special protections? Here's another one. This one's in Greece. A restaurant displayed a sign at its entrance essentially banning Zionists and fascists. Here's another one. So awful. Combat anti-Semitism. A woman stood outside Parliament in a Holocaust-style costume with striped clothing and an inverted red triangle, a Hamas support symbol. It's a grotesque stunt. Any more grotesque than having a Holocaust museum on every corner and showing people how Jews were put through meat grinders, but we don't actually have any evidence of it. We just suspect this is what happened. Here's another one. Jerusalem Post. German student Ron Deckel told the Post that he does not see alternatives for European Jewry other than to fight for a future in their countries. Here's another one. Some guy made a video. Should I pay my taxes this year or should I just write a check to Israel directly? Rabbi Shmuley says, I'll just take that for you. Send to info@shmuley.com. Thanks, my anti-Semitic brother. Thing is, he's probably actually serious about that. It's called sarcasm. Here's another one. Another synagogue covered in police tape. Jewish neighborhood in Toronto looked like this now. This is just the new reality. Oh, it's happening all over the place. Here's another one. Israeli celebrity chef closes Berlin restaurant amid constant threats. So there's synagogues and there's restaurants being attacked in Berlin. That's what's happening. Well, that's just what happened in the 1930s. It's the same thing that happened in the 1930s. So it's happening again. Why is it happening again? How is it happening? I thought we'd say never again. Why is it happening again? Because it wasn't the government that did these things. It was the public. The public was sick of it. And the public reacted to it. And that's what is happening again, except this is happening worldwide. I want to show you something else too. This is a video that has, I thought at first it was fake, but this turned out to be, quote, real. This is a Jewish guy attacking a nun. Did you watch this? Shoves this woman into the pavement. For those of you thinking, well, that's a fake story. Well, I thought it was at first too. I thought it was just out of context. But a bunch of Israeli newspapers picked it up. Some Israeli newspapers have also been reporting on the IDF soldier smashing the statue of Jesus. And I thought about it real long and real hard. I was like, you know what, maybe what's happening here by the acknowledgement that the IDF vandalizes statues of Jesus and Jews attack nuns and beat them to death or rape them. It's common practice. Spitting on Christians is common. I wonder if all of that is not the overwhelming number of cases and so the exposure of it. But I wonder if what it actually is an attempt to do the following. It is an attempt to make it appear, to make it seem as if Israel, Zionists, Jews, etc., don't actually despise Christianity, don't despise nuns and Jesus. They actually love them, and that's why they're willing to protect them. And you might think, well, that's kind of contradictory to the, thousands of other cases where the opposite is true. I summarize my thoughts with this. The two cases reported here of a nun being attacked in Jerusalem and an IDF soldier smashing a Jesus statue should raise some suspicion. Although we cannot in good faith paint every Israeli and member of the IDF with the same broad stroke, it is clear that anti-Christian sentiment is highly prevalent in Israel and within Jewish communities. With exposure of the previous facts, it appears that these two high-profile cases, which went viral when others were denied and suppressed, are simply meant to make Israel, the IDF, Jews, etc., seem reasonable, to make them appear as the defenders of Christianity against a few bad apples. In other words, this isn't Israel admitting something that is part of a long-standing tradition. This is Israel denying that there is a tradition. This is Israel and Jews saying, we don't do these things. We don't believe these things. That's why we're willing to protect the nun. We're willing to protect that statue of Jesus. This is just propaganda slop, is all that it is. That's all any of this stuff is. Here's another version of that propaganda slop. The second Holocaust is coming. Did you know that? There's another Holocaust on the way. Now, what exactly is that Holocaust? According to Shuki Friedman, the question of whether a second Holocaust is plausible in the foreseeable future may sound like an intellectual provocation, but a cold-eyed look at today's geopolitical and social reality shows that it is a real danger. Unless we are proactive in preventing this risk from materializing, we may find ourselves facing such a reality far sooner than anyone would have imagined just a few years ago. Contemporary anti-Semitism is no longer a marginal phenomenon perpetrated by a small lunatic fringe of insiders. It mainly festers in two dangerous forms: as open, brutal hatred of Jews as individuals in diaspora communities, and as a radical echo chamber calling for the destruction of the state of Israel or its elimination as the nation state of the Jewish people. Only determined action by Israel and Jews around the world can remedy this. Now, for those of you who might need some clarification here, what is being said, this has been echoed by several leading Jewish authorities, is that the second Holocaust is first and foremost defined not as a gassing, not as making bars of soap, not as ovens, not as making lampshades. The second Holocaust is defined first and foremost as open, brutal hatred of Jews. Now, you can say what you want about any group of people, whether they're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, black, white, Asian, Indian, doesn't really matter. I guess India is technically Asia, but you get the point. Say what you want about any group of people. You're allowed to hate if you want to hate. If you don't want to like X group of people, you don't have to like those people. Personally, I don't have very good interactions with Indians. Personally, I don't have really good interactions with Chinese. Personally, I don't have a lot of really good actions with a lot of people. But there's a ton of people I have really good interactions with. I know why that is. It's cultural. I know that for a fact it's cultural. Because the way that I live my life, the things that I believe, acting and believing those things in the U.S., ran me up against a wall of rejection and ran me up against a wall of ideologies that were in opposition to what I thought. Talking to people from other countries, not so much. So it's cultural. And I get along with certain groups of people, whether they look like me or not, because we're culturally compatible. And some cultures are not compatible. As an individual, sure, you could live within them, but collectively, some cultures are incompatible with other cultures. That's just a fact. It might be considered racist or wrong to say, I hate insert group of people, but there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with hating the president. There's nothing wrong with hating blacks or Jews or whites or anybody. When people say, I can't believe that you hate Chinese or you hate blacks or you hate Indians, well, I also hate white people too. I don't even know what a white person is, to be honest with you. I don't know what a white supremacist is. I'm having trouble understanding what the term is, considering that they call blacks and Hispanics white supremacists and call white people like myself who come to Asia, they call us white supremacists. I don't know how that works. Cultural compatibility matters. And if you want to hate a group of people, maybe it's wrong, morally or ethically, but you're allowed to. And I want it to be very clear that the definition of a Holocaust in this instance is hatred of Jews. Not killing Jews, not rounding them up, not burning them in ovens or turning them into ash or gassing them. Just hatred of Jews. That's the Holocaust. Now, you could say, well, maybe what they're saying is it's going to lead to murder. Well, I mean, you could argue that, but no, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what's being said here. What's being said here is if you don't like Jews, that's a Holocaust. And it's interesting that that is the modern contemporary definition of a Holocaust. As I have shown you on this show before, if you translate, and some of them are already in English, but if you translate the Hebrew of the pages of testimony that are used to classify the missing 5 to 6 million people, one, you don't have to actually provide any kind of evidence for missing people. You just say, hey, I haven't talked to my dad in X number of years. Oh, they must have been murdered at Auschwitz. That's literally the standard of Yad Vashem. But I've shown you this before where the pages of testimony, what they show is if you were inconvenienced by Nazism, like you weren't killed, your business was shut down, and you had to, or you chose to shut it down, and you chose to leave Germany, that would classify you as a victim of the Holocaust. Does that make sense? I want that to be really crystal clear, because it means that people that are considered victims of the Holocaust are simply people that are inconvenienced by the truth or inconvenienced by people's opinions that they're allowed to have. You can have an opinion that you don't like Jews. You don't have a right to not like Jews. I have a right to not like anybody. I have a right to not like myself. If I don't want to like myself, I don't have to like myself. I'll show you one of these pages of testimony so that you can see it here for yourself. I'll screenshot this from my book so I don't have to open up a new tab. This is what one of the pages of testimony looks like from Yad Vashem. Well, I just had it. I'll have to screenshot it again. Give me one moment. Okay, this is a page of testimony here. Just to prove my point so you don't think I'm making this up. That's what they look like. If you translate it, the memory of all the Jews who fell, fought, and rebelled, and their helpers and their positions and their communities that were destroyed because of so on and so forth. That's the translation. You don't even have to provide a picture, by the way. Do you get what I'm getting at here? Do you see what I'm saying? The 5 million number, the 6 million number, is derived from these kinds of reports, people that report fighting against Nazism, not even in the trenches, just fighting like, I don't like it, so I'm a victim of the Holocaust. That is literally the contemporary definition of the Holocaust. That is the second Holocaust that's on its way. It's going to happen. Defined as hatred of Jews, which itself isn't even properly defined. So what does that actually mean? What am I getting at here? Here's the Jerusalem Post. This is in Italy. The new face of an old hate. What is that new hate in Italy? Jews not feeling welcomed. Well, they don't feel welcomed anywhere they go. Except maybe Japan, they claim. If you don't like Jews, you've committed a Holocaust. Let's read from the Holocaust Encyclopedia. Introduction to the Holocaust. It's going to be a little bit different than what you assumed. What did you think the Holocaust was, by the way? Did you think it was like Hitler came to power and said, all right, to the ovens? Yeah, well, that's not actually what happened. This is the official narrative from the Holocaust Encyclopedia. Anti-Semitism was the foundation of the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism, the hatred of or prejudice against Jews, was a basic tenet of Nazi ideology. This prejudice was also widespread throughout Europe. Yes, it was also widespread throughout the entire world, anywhere Jews had been. Call it anti-Semitism, call it whatever you want to call it, but there's no background given here of why people felt that way. Today, folks, you are learning why people feel that way, why people felt that way, and why more people will begin to feel this way. Because the world isn't separated anymore by oceans and air. We have planes and boats. We can travel really fast. Information can travel instantaneously. I can tell you this from Tokyo right now, and you get maybe like a half a second delay wherever you are listening in the world. You don't have to wait now for film reels from Jewish companies to come back from Europe to show you about how evil Hitler is, and go to a movie theater and pay Jewish theater owners money to watch Jewish propaganda about how evil Hitler is and why you should send your sons to die in that war for Jewish bankers. You don't have to do that anymore. You can just get on the internet and you can see it. Of course, that opens up the door for a bunch of dis and misinformation. That's why it is there in the first place, because there's too much access to just raw information, so they have to muddy the waters, but we don't have to do that anymore. So now you're watching in real time as the whole world wakes up like the Germans did in the 1930s. And we just get, well, I mean, anti-Semitism was the foundation, so if anti-Semitism exists today, then we must be Nazis. Well, why did they think those things? Key fact number 2, Nazi Germany's This is a really important key fact. Nazi Germany's persecution of Jews evolved and became increasingly more radical between 1933 and 1945. And they claim this radicalization culminated in the mass murder of 6 million Jews. That's not even acknowledged on Yad Vashem's website, which is like the official We Count Jew website. Yad Vashem, type in Yad Vashem. This is a recent story, by the way. Yad Vashem has recovered the names of 5 million Jews murdered. That's not 6 million. And yes, that 1 million number is a really important piece of information. Furthermore, of those 5 million, you learn that this is being determined by AI and machine learning. There's too many documents to go through. They haven't been able to go through these documents since the 40s. You've had almost 100 years. You can't go through the documents and find evidence because there is no evidence, just missing people during war. Work facilities, work camps, communist labor camps, etc., prisoners of war, etc. No different, no more unique than any other country, any other war battle in the history of mankind. The camps that the British set up in Africa, the camps that the Soviets set up, the gulags, or the Americans set up for the Japanese, or the Japanese set up for the Chinese or the Koreans, and vice versa. Like, it's not any different. Or there's nothing new or unique about any of this. And how did they get these names? From those pages of testimony, which literally are people that are inconvenienced by something at the time. Meaning that even if you were in America, and let's say the exports of you had a product that was selling well in Germany, but because you're a Jewish company, now people are boycotting it in Germany. You can't make as much money now. You now are a victim of the 5 to 6 million. That's how it works. Just so we're clear, on your screen, this is the definition of the page of testimony. People that fell, and not even people that died. People that fell, sure, that may imply dying, but fought, rebelled. People that helped those people fought or rebel, fight or rebel. And it acknowledges this on Yad Vashem's website. That's the page of testimony, and that creates the basis for 5 million. And this is important because the Holocaust Encyclopedia still not only uses the 6 million, but admits and acknowledges in the open headline of Introduction to the Holocaust, probably the most incredible admission ever. The Holocaust was the systematic state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews. But if you go down to the next line, the Holocaust was an evolving process that took place throughout Europe between 1933 and 1945. And if you read the line below that, it says, Nazi Germany's persecution evolved and became increasingly more radical over those 12 years. Meaning that the Nazis did not have a plan to murder Jews, and meaning that it took over a decade for anybody to even get to the point where that was discussed. And then you learn what the Holocaust/final solution was. The final solution at the Wannsee Conference was the mass deportation of Jews to Palestine, among other places. Palestine was more in the 30s of the Havara Agreement in 1933. Leave. Hitler gave them an opportunity to leave. Leave. Take your smut, take your perversity, take your incest, take your gender, sex obsession with you, and get out. This is on the Holocaust Encyclopedia website. They acknowledge this. Here's another one, another part of the website, Timeline of Events. And you can read all about this. The beginnings of the Holocaust, 1933. Well, what were those beginnings of the Holocaust? The Nazi dictatorship, it wasn't a dictatorship, by the way. I don't know why they call Hitler a dictator. The Nazi dictatorship implemented radical racial, political, and social policies, all in response to radical Jewish racial supremacist ideology, Jewish control of politics and infiltration of the same, and Jewish social policies, which included pornography given to children, mother-daughter tag team prostitutes, and, of course, economic issues where you had to have a stack of money to buy a loaf of bread. And during the first 6 years of Hitler's rule, German Jews felt the effects of legislation that transformed them from citizens to outcasts. In the 1930s, the regime also targeted a variety of alleged enemies of the state within German society. Yes, that would be the communists. You read the Holocaust Encyclopedia, they're always very, very careful to not tell you what led to the anti-Semitism, what led to the inflation, what led to the pornography and the perversity and the smut and the garbage in your face everywhere you went. They are really careful not to mention why Hitler took control of the media. They're really careful not to mention anything of value, because if you start to mention those things, the whole narrative unwinds and comes apart. Even this part about Nazi Germany invading Poland, that is not accurate. That is not how it happened. It's because agreements that the British had with the Polish. That's one of the primary reasons. It's in newspapers at the time. Hitler offered peace, a 16-point peace plan, so many times. His head was probably spinning. Even before the invasion, they offered one more time. Here's the peace deal. We just want to protect Germans. We want to get our land back, all from the Treaty of Versailles, all from the First World War. Like, it was really explicit. And this is the crazy thing. As someone who grew up reading a lot of history books, as someone who grew up and who was obsessed with American history, but all history in general, I was in advanced placement history. I failed almost every class. I almost failed English. I almost failed math. I was D. I was really good at history, advanced placement. They didn't teach me any of this stuff. And then when I went to start reading official sources, including newspaper articles, I was like, wait a minute, why didn't anybody tell me Hitler had offered a 16-point peace plan over and over and over and over again? Why wasn't that at least, like, mentioned? Over and over and over again, Hitler offered a peace plan. There was publication all over the world of the negotiations. Maybe you don't believe me. There's no way Hitler offered a peace plan. No, and it was predicated on the return of Danzig, which is where ethnic Germans were being persecuted by communists, reportedly. It's kind of the same thing with Russian, was it Donbass region? Oh, there's the newspaper article of one of many. Here's the 16 points Hitler proposed. I know it's a little bit blurry to read that one here. I'll get a screenshot of the enhanced version. And this was published in more than one newspaper, for the record, so you can see this for yourself. And just little things like this, like no one ever showed me this in school. No one ever taught me about this. No one ever told me about this. What did Hitler actually want? He was just insane. He invaded Poland for no reason. Then you're like, well, what did he actually say? He didn't say anything. Well, why did newspapers print this? Hitler's 16-point plan sets out Danzig, on account of its purely German character and the unanimous will of its population, shall return to the Reich unconditionally and forthwith. I don't care if you agree with it or you don't agree with it. The fact is, Hitler didn't just do things without a reason. There was a specific reason. Mein Kampf was a list of reasons, and it was in newspapers at the time. Everybody knew it. It was the British who tried to force Hitler's hand and force the world into a war. Wendell Willkie said it, running for the presidency of the United States, and opposition to Churchill said it before he became prime minister. If this fat, drunk, disgusting piece of garbage slob, Churchill, becomes the prime minister, he is going to drive the British into a war with Germany. He will start a world war. Hitler said it. Opposition to Churchill said it. Wendell Willkie, who ran for president in the U.S., said it. It's in the archives. It's like mainstream news even. It's like in news articles at the time. And we're just told, no, there was no reason for it. No, there was a reason. The thing is, they don't want you to know that there was a reason, because when you actually read the reason, you're like, oh, this is actually really rational. Oh, they offered peace like 100 times. Wait a minute. I've been lied to. You can read the rest of the points. The Polish corridor. This is another one. It's like, this is the second point. The Polish corridor shall decide for itself whether it desires to belong to Germany or Poland. He was a dictator who just took over land. And he said, well, they can decide whether they want to be part of Germany or Poland. That's up to them. They can vote on it. We're just concerned primarily with Danzig. You can read it. Those entitled to vote in the, it's hard to read that word, plebiscite will be all Germans and Poles resident in the corridor since January 1st, 1938, or born therein. All Germans expelled from the corridor or forced to leave will return in order to vote. There's like a really clear list of things that are written out here. Now, doesn't this sound kind of familiar to what's happening with Iran? The Iranians aren't talking to us. The Iranians aren't going to make the deal. They're crazy. It's the same Jewish media telling us that the Iranians are crazy. The Iranians don't want to make a deal. The Iranians are wanting war. It's the same thing we were told about Hitler. And it turns out when you see this propaganda happening in real time, and there were people that saw it back in the 30s, back in the 40s, of course, their voices are silenced by one means or another, by death or by suppression of publication. When you see this happening to Iran today, it's the same exact story. When you see these patterns, Jew hatred, it's going to be a second Holocaust. Yeah, but hating somebody isn't a Holocaust. I thought the Holocaust was like murdering Jews. It turns out that hatred of Jews is considered the second Holocaust. It turns out pages of testimony where people were inconvenienced are considered part of the 5 to 6 million. It turns out that Nazi Germany did not have a plan to murder Jews. Did you know that? Look at this. What was the Holocaust? When they came to power in Germany, the Nazis did not immediately start to carry out the mass murder of Jews. In fact, they acknowledge this in the very start of the article where they say this didn't begin until the 40s, which means that what, they went a decade? They just got in power and they started killing Jews, right? No, it was like admittedly over a decade before anything severe actually was done. Or we'll say close to a decade before anything was actually done that was more aggressive. So the guy that hated Jews, he was just obsessed. His mustache was all over the place, hair flapping in the wind, just so insane, so crazy. Just Jews, I hate Jews. This caricature of a villain that we've been given in every Hollywood movie. I'm supposed to believe that he was that rabid, but he waited a real long time to murder these people. I have a hard time understanding how that makes any sense. And that's, of course, if you even get to that point, because normally you're taught that there just was no reason and that the Holocaust was like, just murdering random people. And you find out, well, that's actually that's not how World War II started. That's not what any of this was about. And by the way, it's just fun. It's funny too. Like, this is in the U.S. National Archives. This is an image right here on the screen. For those of you who can't see this, just go to Introduction to the Holocaust Encyclopedia. This is what the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses looked like. Some SA stormtroopers with signs standing outside of Jewish businesses. One of the signs says, "Germans, defend yourselves, don't buy from Jews." Is that maybe similar a little bit to the idea of boycotting Israeli products today? Could that have some similar feel to it a little bit? I know I've mentioned this before to you, but if you were to go look at these boycotts, this image that you see right here, this is the boycott. Okay, this is the boycott. And I'm going to show you this. I'll pull this up in real time. I have the quote from my book. Here's the Holocaust Encyclopedia, Boycott of Jewish Businesses. April 1st, nationwide economic boycott. And this is what you're told. Just like anti-Semitism was the root, there's no definition of why people were, quote, anti-Semitic, just blind hatred. There's no reason, even though books are written on it. Lots of books are written on it. Nationwide boycott, April 1st, 1933. And I was taught about this. I was taught about how there's a boycott against Jewish businesses. And there was even the Night of Broken Glass, which, by the way, was like a singular thing. And then you learn that something actually happened prior to April 1st. You want to know what happened before April 1st? There's a whole bunch of Jewish sources. Here's the Jewish Virtual Library talking about what happened before this, before April 1st. So SA officers stood outside of businesses, and this is also, by the way, remember, in large part advocated for by the German public, who were tired of this even before the government did anything about it. which is why the government did something about it, because the people voted for a government that would do something about it. You see how this is going to happen in the U.S. again, too? You see how this is going to happen, part 2, or maybe part 110? It's going to happen in the U.S. again, too. We're on the verge of it happening right now. Whether it's synthetic or it's organic is another question, but we're on the verge of it. So this is what this is the worst picture that the encyclopedia could find. Some SA guys standing outside of a business explaining to a woman why the business is closed. And this is probably a Jewish woman. Why is the business closed? Well, we're defending the German people. That's what they want. That's the worst thing they can find. There's nobody being burned, nobody being shot, nobody being gassed, nobody being put in an oven. Just some guys standing outside with signs that say, boycott the business. Which means that it wasn't a dictatorship, because if it was a dictatorship, the government would have said, the business is shut down. You can't shop here. End of story. It was the German government telling citizens, probably mostly what they wanted to hear anyway, but telling the citizens, look, you should definitely boycott these businesses. If you weren't aware of this before, you should be aware of it now. Yeah, this is from the National Archives. This is the worst picture that they could find. This is all horrible. They held signs up. April 1st. But if we go to some Jewish sources, let's look and see what we can find. Now, again, there was probably more than just some signs. Like, there were definitely a few altercations, just like we have altercations at Walmart. People fight over Pokemon cards. And a few undefined, undescribed, undocumented cases of like people getting into arguments and fights, not even necessarily Jews, just people getting into arguments and fights, maybe people that wanted to shop at the store who weren't Jewish and wanted to go into the store. And the Germans said no. And maybe they got roughed up a little bit. Maybe they attacked the police first. Who knows? Maybe they punched an SA officer. We'll never know. And that is described by the Jewish Virtual Library, My Jewish Learning, all these Jewish websites. It's the same story, copy and pasted to a bunch of them. This is in their words. This is what they say. When word of the assaults, again, assaults, these are the assaults, signs. When word of the assaults reached America by Jewish media, representatives of the American Jewish Committee, B'nai B'rith, and the American Jewish Congress met in New York. The conferees established a joint committee to monitor the situation, but agreed that organized public protests in America would further undermine the already precarious position of German Jewry. Less than a month later, however, the American Jewish Congress changed its mind and called on its partners to help organize an American protest campaign. On March 12, 1933, the American Jewish Congress resolved to hold a mass protest rally at Madison Square Garden. They always tell you about there's a neo-Nazi rally. Trump had one too. Actually, the Jewish Congress had one at Madison Square Garden. A week later, this would have been, March 19th, 1933, the organization convened an emergency conference of Jewish organizations that 1,500 individuals attended. At the emergency meeting, the AJ Congress announced its intention to hold a Madison Square Garden rally on March 27th. George Fredman, commander-in-chief of the Jewish war veterans, called for an American boycott of German imports. After Fredman spoke, Joseph Proskauer and Judge Irving Lehman of the American Jewish Committee publicly counseled restraint. Lehman feared that a rally in America may add to the terrible dangers of the Jews in Germany. Lehman pleaded, I implore you in the name of humanity, don't let anger pass a resolution which will kill Jews in Germany. So there were several Jews who were opposed to these boycotts. Rabbi Wise, president of the American Jewish Congress, honorary president, said, the time for prudence and caution is past. We must speak up like men. How can we ask our Christian friends to lift their voices and protest against the wrongs suffered by Jews if we keep silent? What is happening in Germany today may happen tomorrow in any other land on earth unless it is challenged and rebuked. And again, what was happening is signs. It's not the German Jews who are being attacked. It's the Jews. On March 27th, the AJ Congress and its allies convened simultaneous protest rallies at Madison Square Garden in New York, in Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cleveland, and 70 other locations. This was in the 1930s, folks. This isn't Facebook groups, social media groups. This is in 1933.
How did they get this many people to gather together at 70 places around the country, including New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cleveland? Because Jews had control of the press. Jews had control of the media, which, even though wasn't as, of course, widespread as social media is and access to the internet today, was the central source of information. And if you controlled all of that, you got the entire public to believe whatever you wanted to get them to believe. An overflow crowd of 55,000 inside the garden and in the streets outside heard AJ Congress President Bernard Deutsch, American Federation of Labor President William Green, Senator Robert Wagner, former New York Governor Al Smith, and several Christian clergy call for an immediate cessation of the brutal treatment being inflicted on German Jewry. Again, brutal treatment meaning signs. Does it make sense now? Do you understand what is happening today in America? And do you understand how the chronology of months work? Because if you haven't noticed yet, this assault, i.e., sign holding, was the nationwide boycott held on April 1st. You may have noticed that the Jews in America were really angry in March. In other words, this thing about Jewish businesses being boycotted, what an anti-Semitic, horrible thing that was happening. It turns out that the Jewish protests in America, it turns out that the Jewish press in America was directly responsible for the Germans saying, all right, well, if you're going to do it, we're going to do it. And specifically because the German currency was already on the edge. Inflation, homelessness, starvation were through the roof, joblessness, etc. And the Germans, rightfully so, accused the Jews of orchestrating an international campaign to destroy what was left of Germany because Germany had rebelled against 10 plus years of Jewish, Weimar, communist, Bolshevik perversity in the country. So let's get this real clear and real crystal, real straight. International Jews in America especially had no issue with the cutting off of penises, with the sewing up of vaginas, although I guess they didn't technically do that. They did cut off penises. The Institute of Sexual Science didn't have any issue with the pornography, the smut, the garbage, the degrading of women, the mother-daughter tag team prostitutes. No problem with the inflation, no problem with any of that in Germany. When the Germans finally stood up and said, we're done with this. We have collectively identified that all the people that publish these newspapers, all the people that put this crap on the book stands, that's where most of it is, where you got your information, newsstands. Put it in the books, the magazines, the newspapers, the people that put this on the stage in the theater, the people that put this on the radio, that are in the hospitals, that are in the legal offices, that are in the government, the people that are in the schools teaching our kids this. We're done with it. Get your shit and get the fuck out of our country. We don't want you here. That's what the public said. Hitler came to power and said, get your stuff and leave, please. The Jews rebelled. Communists rebelled. They began to act out violently. And in acting out violently, do you know what happened? The German government said, okay, if you're going to act in that way, we're going to have to do something about it. And what they did about it was they started rounding up communists and putting them in concentration camps. Did you know that? If you read my new book, you'll learn all about it. And I have some pictures of that. Here is Buchenwald, or Buchenwald, concentration camp. Never designated a death camp. It was used for forced labor and political prisoners, specifically violent communists That's where these people were sent when they didn't choose to leave. This particular image shows a Jewish dominant political revolutionary terrorist group that had not only tried to stop Hitler from coming to power and cleaning up the rot in Germany, but when it failed, when their plan failed, went on to rally against the imprisonment of that same rot. You'll know who this group is because you've seen them in the news recently. They're called Antifa. That's right. The original Antifa were Jews fighting, quote, Nazis. The original Antifa was a Jewish paramilitary organization that was violent, by the way. Sound familiar? Here they are in 1932, before Hitler even came to power, at the Anti-Fascist Action Conference in Germany. This is a real photograph. They've even got the hammer and sickle there. Look at that. And look at their flag. It's the same flag. Wow. Antifa was then, as it is today, a paramilitary wing of the Communist Party in whatever form it takes. In 1932, it was a branch of the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party of Germany, or the KDP, founded by the Jewish Rosa Luxemburg, who, by the way, Winston Churchill was very aware of who Rosa Luxemburg was and all the other Jews who had undermined various cultures and societies and economies. Churchill wrote about that in the 1920s. Antifa tried to stop Hitler from coming to power. When that didn't work, they got violent. Hitler put them in camps. They protested and painted this in the history books as Jews were rounded up for being innocent, kind, contributing members of society. Hitler just hated them. That is not what happened. The original Antifa were Jews fighting American Nazis. The American-German Bund organization was a pro-Nazi movement in America. Nothing illegal about that. By the way, they were peaceful, and they were protesting not in favor of Nazi Germany. They were protesting against the war. Let's not have any kind of conflict or war with Germany. That's really, really dumb. Do you know what Antifa did and the Jewish mafia did in places like New Jersey and New York? They went, I can read it to you from the Jewish Forward newspaper here. The local Jewish population was alarmed by the pro-Nazi rhetoric of the Bund, not to mention the sight of brown shirt activists chanting and sharing Nazi salutes right here in the good old USA. And so the Jewish community went to local authorities, many of whom they pay and have on their payroll, because again, this is the mafia, and said, we don't like these protests that are completely legal under the First Amendment. Jews then turned, if they hadn't before, directly to the actual literal Jewish mafia, which people deny is a thing. It's a real thing. It was 50% of the Italian mafia was Jewish. Gambling, whatever. I mean, specifically gambling. It's been in newspapers since like the 50s or something. Like Jews are the most obsessed group of people with gambling. They just love it. They have to gamble. That's where a lot of that money for the mafia came from for the Jews. Most of it was gambling. Same thing with Adelson, or the Adelsons. Jews then turned to the Jewish mafia. They turned to Abner Zvilman, or Longy, who employed somebody named Sidney Nathan Abramovich, or Abramowitz, I think it's pronounced Abramowitz. And they formed a civil rights group. And they formed this group under the same First Amendment legal protections that the Bund was formed under. Are you following along? And then the Jewish mafia, under those legal protections, went after the Bund. They got in their face. They engaged in violence. They forced them to defend themselves. And then the police came and rounded up the Bund. They rounded up the American Nazis who were saying no war. And it was a bunch of Jews using the First Amendment to undercut and undermine the First Amendment rights of other Americans. And they did this with the mafia and control of law enforcement and the media. Does that sound familiar? Because that is exactly what is happening today. This is what actually happened. Which is why the ADL also says that anti-Antifa images, if you don't like Antifa, that's anti-Semitic. Yes, because Antifa is a Jewish, quote, Semitic organization. It is not some left-wing radical group solely. It is a Jewish communist group. I don't care what you think about this. That is a fact. Here's their old logo and their new logo. The original was all red. The new one is black and red. You could say Marxist, communist, Leninist, whatever, to kind of anarcho-communist, anti-fascist action today. Anti-Antifa images are anti-Semitic. That's because it is a, quote, Semitic organization. Back to our addressing of the boycotts. People boycotted because there was a boycott happening in the United States. Do you recall that there's a couple of, there's a Jewish couple. I'll type this in right now in real time. Type in Jewish couple. I believe it's indivisible protest group. And here's the Times of Israel. If you click on this and read it, you'll learn about how this Jewish couple, Leigh Greenberg and Ezra Levin, started this movement under the name of Indivisible. And it has accumulated 5,000 plus local groups. And it is this group, Indivisible. You can read it right here. Guide to Grassroots Advocacy, downloaded millions of times. They're associated and affiliated with thousands of groups. This is the group that is primarily behind all of these protests. For example, here's one. Hands off my health care. Don't take away my health care. That's a Jewish protest. Pussy hats, Jewish protest. Black Lives Matter, Jewish protest. They're all Jewish protests. This is the same exact thing that we just read about those protests in 1933. Basically, overnight, through control of the media, an issue that Americans were not aware of, nor did they really care, was made so severe that tens of thousands of people in Madison Square Garden alone gathered, inside and outside, and at 70 other locations nationwide. The Nazi apparatus, quote, denounced the American complaints as slanders generated by Jews of German origin. 100% correct. That's exactly what it was. That's a fact. Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels announced a campaign of sharp countermeasures against these attacks. He accused German Jewry of engineering a worldwide boycott of German goods to destroy the German economy. That's exactly what it was. And we know that's what it was because, once again, some signs, April 1st, April Fools, actually, the Jews organized the protests in March against German goods. And Joseph Goebbels said, if you don't stop, then we're going to crush you. Because they'd already destroyed Germany, and what was left of it, what the pieces were that they picked up, the Jews said, all right, here's what's going to happen. You can't resist. So if you try to resist, we're going to bring the whole world against you. It's like blackmail. It's like extortion. It's like threats. That's basically what World War II ended up being. It ended up being like a blackmail war by Jews against the entirety of the human race. That's what World War I was too. That's what World War III is and is going to be as well. That's why this is important to talk about. Because when they tell you things like, oh, you know, the Iranians, they've hated us, they held hostages. Well, yeah, but see, stuff happened before 1979. When they tell you things like, well, you know, this UFO thing is a big problem suddenly. Well, you know, stuff happened before that New York Times article in 2017. When they tell you Hitler had no reason to do what he did, he was just madman, a crazy guy. Oh, he had reasons. It was in newspapers. He wrote a book about it. And also, when they say there was some protests and they hated Jews, well, see, again, the Jews did that first, and they used their control of the press, just like their control of the police, to beat the American public into submission. And around this time is where the idea of Judeo-Christianity came from. Judeo-Christianity. We're brothers in this. And as you can read in that article that I just showed you, Rabbi Wise says this. How can we ask our Christian friends to lift their voices in protest against the wrongs suffered by the Jews if we keep silent? See, at the time, there was not really the concept of Judeo-Christianity. In fact, much of the Jewish issue in Germany was because the Jewish, let's say, culture was wholly incompatible with traditional German culture, which, by the way, was also very Christian. It was incompatible. Interesting, because that's the same talking point they use today for Islam. Islam is incompatible. Actually, Judaism's incompatible. It's incompatible simply by the very nature of its closed offness. And the other reason it opens itself up is to get people to do its bidding for it. This is this is what was happening in Rome. And there is a Judeo-Christian element that is very real. It's like the Jews said, if you study our religious text, if you try to become one of us, we'll kill you. It's in the Talmud, the real one. And if you were to look at the way that the Christians handled themselves, they became popular initially because the Christians said anybody can be part of this, anybody can be saved. Then the Christians later adopted the same cult attitude and said, look, the Jews said, if you try to convert, we'll kill you. The Christians said, if you don't convert, we'll kill you. And much, much later, Judeo-Christianity came about because some rabbis and some Jews wanted to convince the general American public that justifiable, honest, in good faith protest against Jewish corruption in Germany was a threat and that those Jews needed to be saved. In other words, the mechanized death of World War II was essentially a sacrifice on the altar of Jewish economics. That's basically what it was. All those people that were murdered, all those people that were slaughtered, that were starving to death, that were burned alive at Dresden, Tokyo, etc. All those people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were murdered, including the Christian capital of the Eastern world, specifically detonating the atomic bomb, a Jewish atomic bomb, by Jewish advisors to the White House to detonate a Jewish atomic bomb over the Christian capital, over the Christian valley of the Christian capital of the Eastern world. All of this is happening again. All of this is repeating again. So you can think that I'm a bad person for talking about it. You can call me names. 99.9% of the audience understands exactly what I'm saying. As a matter of fact, I should upload this other show again. I did a show when I hosted Ground Zero several times this year. I did a show on this. There was zero censorship. I did a show on this. And I think it was probably one of the best shows I'd ever done on Ground Zero when I hosted. We had loaded phone calls the entire night, more than any UFO or weird conspiracy show that we had done. And people were calling in and agreeing, not out of some like, I'm a skinhead here in Arkansas, and I want to say I agree with you. No, none of that. Just really smart people calling in and saying, yep, I read those newspapers. Hitler wrote it in his book. Why do people act like we don't know what the reasons were? And there was nothing unique about what Hitler did. There's nothing unique about what even the gulags were. There's nothing unique about any of this in history. Look at what Genghis Khan did. Look at what the Chinese did to their own people. That's another thing with this like anti-Japanese propaganda. There's like reparations. The Japanese people need to reparations. It's the same crap they say with slavery in the West. The same thing they sell Americans every single day. Reparations for blacks, reparation. And in Japan, that's what they're doing. You got to reparations. You got to atone for your sins. And then you find out, wait a minute, hold on. whatever the Japanese did to like Nanking and other places, the Chinese did that to themselves. Like, what was that? 15 years, 20, 30 years later within that time span? So if the Japanese need to worry about reparations, like the Chinese should be giving reparations to their people. Their government slaughtered 60 million of them. How about the communists give reparations to the hundreds of millions that they murdered? Hundreds of millions that they slaughtered. Guess that's not going to happen. The point is, the finalist solution, the Pogroms progress, that is what is happening. That is what will continue to happen. I'm surprised it's happening so fast, but it is happening very fast. And there really isn't much we can do about it, except at least try to differentiate between what is the organic movement and what is the synthetic version of it, which is meant to just lull the public back to sleep. And unfortunately, this is my premise for the show. This is why I quoted that Max Planck discussion that he had with Adolf Hitler, where he says that a Jew is a Jew, all Jews stick together. Where there is one Jew, all kinds of other Jews gather right away. It would have been the duty of the Jews themselves to draw a dividing line between the various groups. They did not do this, and that is why I must act against all Jews equally. The context of that is also important in regard to post-1933 Germany, because it was possible for Jews in Germany who were war veterans. There were some from the First World War, and they actually went very easy on those people. There were some that had never done anything, never broke a law. They had done things to the benefit of Germany. They spoke the language. Those people were not targeted, at least initially. But it was the spillover, just like you see spillover in like radical conservatives or radical liberal groups, where people just really just don't understand the Constitution or don't understand like conservative values or even liberal values for that matter, and they just go to the furthest extreme. You have that too, of course. And every little infraction of that is selected from, so you get this vague story of how people holding up a sign was somehow assault. And that even though the Germans were protesting on April 1st, that means they started it even though the Jews were protesting in March and trying to convince the American public that the Germans were murdering Jews, even though that's acknowledged that it didn't start happening until like the 1940s. It's all a big fabricated lie. And it's not as simple as, quote, Holocaust denial. I'm not ever denying that there's a Holocaust. There was one in Hiroshima. There was one in Nagasaki. There was one in Dresden. There was one in Tokyo. I mean, like literally the definition, you can say what you want about like the Armenian Holocaust or Rwandan or any of those. Or, I mean, you could say that about the Holodomor, et cetera. I saw some people in the chat mention that. The reason I bring up Japan is not just because I live here. The reason I bring up Japan is because literally the definition of a Holocaust is exactly what happened to Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, and other cities that were also bombed, but nothing to the extent of like what happened in those cities. I know I've shown it to you before, maybe beating a dead horse, but a destruction or slaughter on a mass scale, especially caused by fire or nuclear war. They firebombed Tokyo. They nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whatever a nuke is. And yet, despite that, the Holocaust is still specially defined as the mass murder of Jewish people. No indication of how they were murdered, just the mass murder of Jewish people. You could call that a genocide or ethnic cleansing, like what they've done to Gaza, or what any group of people in the history of mankind have ever done to people that are close to them that they want to get rid of. There's nothing unique about it. And that's important to address for the Holocaust itself and for, quote, Jew hatred. There's nothing unique or new about any of this. There's nothing unique about murdering large numbers of people. There's nothing unique even about what was done to Tokyo or what was done to Dresden. Just a new time, new weapons, bigger weapons, an ability to murder more people quicker. There's nothing unique about German concentration camps. There's nothing unique about the British ones in Africa. There's nothing unique about the ones that were set up in the Soviet Union, except that they maybe were more brutal. And when people say the Holocaust was a unique experience for Jews, Well, admittedly, they say a whole bunch of other people were murdered too, so it wouldn't be unique for Jews. As a matter of fact, here's what I would argue, and I'd argue this very seriously. I did argue this in my book, Protocols of Goyim. Listen very carefully. If Hitler was specifically targeting Jews and they've tried to make it appear worse than it really is simply because they want to write out all of the other people that also suffered to make the Jewish suffering even more intense, what you're telling me is Hitler discriminated against Jews, right? Okay, so if Hitler discriminated against the Jews and he targeted specifically Jews, even though he said he targeted communists, they just happened to be Jews, but this is the mainstream narrative. If Hitler specifically and explicitly targeted Jews, stay with me, if that's the case, then it was a discriminant form of genocide or Holocaust or whatever you want to call it. What America did to Tokyo was indiscriminate. What the British, to the horror of the Americans at the time, did to Dresden, not only was that a Holocaust, not only was what they did to Tokyo a Holocaust, that is an indiscriminate murder of anybody and everybody in the area of where those bombs dropped. In other words, to put it real simple, Hitler was discriminate. He discriminated against a specific group of people. Churchill, FDR, all the other Western leaders did not discriminate. They didn't discriminate against German soldiers and German civilians. In fact, they and the Soviet Union drove 14 million. I'm not entirely German myself. I've got English and some other stuff, Native American, but I have some German ancestry that calls to me, and they drove out part of my ancestors, 14 million of them, that they tortured, that they raped, that they murdered, and that they forced out of their homes because those homes were literally, I mean literally, given to Jews. They drove Germans out of their homes. They drove Germans out of their businesses. This is after the war. These are people that weren't even involved in the war. These were people like you and I. These are just citizens. They drove them out of their homes and they gave those homes to Jews in places like Berlin. That's if you were lucky enough to survive the Jewish and the Bolshevik and the Soviet rape gangs that went through the streets and raped every German woman they could find. And the funny thing is, if there's anything funny about it, you can't find diddly squat about it on the internet. I mean, this is a Google search. You can't find, there's like virtually no mention of this. Here's one link to Harvard. That's it. That's like the only official source. Everything else is like Wikipedia, Reddit, Instagram. They have completely, not only did they try to obliterate the German people, they have erased even the attempt to obliterate the German people from the history books, from internet searches. Do you know about Germany Must Perish? You ever heard of that book? I can show it to you. Germany Must Perish was a book that was written about the obliteration, the mass murder of Germans. Here's a segment of it from my book, Protocols of Goyim. In March of 1941, approximately 1 year before the so-called final solution was discussed at the Wannsee Conference in January of 1942, a Jewish American businessman named Theodor Kaufman published a book called Germany Must Perish. The book calls for the sterilization of all Germans, not just Nazis. Although, of course, it's been downplayed as the rantings of a single Jew. We don't do the same for Hitler, the rantings of a crazy, mad German. No, he was representative of all the German people. The overall argument in the text matches general Jewish sentiment in the United States going back to the massive Jewish-run anti-German boycotts in 1933. We just learned about those. Whereas the Germans discriminately targeted certain segments of society for very specific reasons, most Jews condemned the German people indiscriminately for no apparent reason whatsoever, except they noticed. As Yad Vashem acknowledges, there is no document in our possession that indicates specifically by whom, at what time, and in what way it was decided to embark on the total extermination of the Jews. Many scholars believe that if such an order did exist, it didn't exist in writing. Instead, it was given orally by Hitler or with his knowledge in the summer of 1941. There's zero record of it at all. It's based on a fairy tale, a fiction. There is, however, evidence that Stalin authorized those mass murders of Poles, but 22,000 of them, in Katyn Forest. Or the Nuremberg massacre that they tried to blame on the Germans too, where they literally peeled the skin off of people, especially religious officials, and crucified them to barn doors. You know, the same way that Israel spits on Christians and attacks nuns, and they have people that just specifically target Christians, Christian communities, churches, and drop bombs on them, like Israel just did to a church in Lebanon the last 12 hours of this show being recorded. Kaufman's book expresses not merely an anti-German sentiment, but foments a vile conspiracy only matched by the fictions and exaggerations about Germany that were sold to the world, largely through Soviet propaganda and Jewish media. What Kaufman proposes is sterilization, nothing short of genocide and preemptive ethnic cleansing of all Germans and territorial dismemberment of Germany, essentially what triggered the war in the first place. Now, if you compare that to what was actually said at the Final Solution Conference, this is the most important part. Due to the war, the immigration plan has been replaced with deportation of the Jews to the east in accordance with the Führer's will. The Germans were proud of what they were doing, but they just didn't put the murder extermination thing in writing, right? They had to secretly code it, right? Just like if you go to Auschwitz today or many of the so-called concentration camps, most of it was built after the war. The wooden gas chamber doors, the chimneys, most of it was built after the war. The ovens that are there, all brought in after the war. None of it was actually, most of those places were actually destroyed, and they had not necessarily Auschwitz, but they had to rebuild most of them. And then they run them as museums, as props. Something no different than if you went to Universal Studios and went on like the Earthquake ride, or I think that was Universal. You went on like the Twister ride. It's a movie set. It's not real. This document is real. The minutes of the Wannsee Conference are real. And this was the actual plan. Due to the war, the immigration plan has been replaced with deportation of the Jews to the east. And contrary to what some people might assume, this is something that you can verify on the Yad Vashem website. If you type in Yad Vashem transcript Wannsee Conference, you can actually read the minutes of the conference, the protocol of the Wannsee Conference, January 20th, 1942. And you can read that was the plan. In fact, let me switch back over so that you can see it. And then we'll go back to the Germany Must Perish book. There it is, right there on the Yad Vashem website. Protocol of the Wannsee Conference, January 20th, 1942. This was the actual final solution plan. Immigration has now been replaced with evacuation of the Jews to the east as a further possible solution with the appropriate prior authorization by the Führer. In the course of this final solution of the European Jewish question, approximately 11 million Jews may be taken into consideration, distributed over the individual countries as follows. So they give a list of the countries where they're going to send the Jews. But no, this, and by the way, I have the actual record of this, like the actual digital scan, like it's in my book, high definition scan of the original conference minutes of the 11 million Jews. And I'm supposed to believe, no, this is all fake. It's not real. No, it is real, folks. You've been lied to. The German final solution was about moving Jews out of the Reich and into a bunch of other territories, some of them that wanted to accept them, some of them that might not have cared, some of them that might not have been able to do anything about it. That was the final solution, getting rid of them. That was it. This is a provable fact. It's not even a debatable fact. The only way that you could debate it is by completely ignoring all of this very, very factual and critical information. And that's how most of these discussions are predicated. That's how they're based. The general public just simply does not know this stuff. If you want to pause and read some of these snapshots of the Germany Must Perish book, you can do so on your screen right now. These are directly from the book. I've put them in my book, Protocols of Goyim. This is a concluding section to the book. Virtually everything they've accused the Germans and the Nazis and Hitler of is precisely what they've done. Indiscriminate murder of people. That's what the British did. That's what the Americans did, respectively at Dresden and Tokyo. The targeting of people based on race. Yes, the Germans did that. Did you also know that the Germans believed that there was an ideal German? In the same way that if people were to look at Sydney Sweeney and say, Sydney Sweeney has great genes, and say she's a poster woman for jeans and other products, lingerie, lotions, creams, potions, all these other things they want to sell you. By the way, her boyfriend's Jewish. I think that's why they're showing you her tits all over the place. But if you were to look at Sydney Sweeney and say, well, that's like the image, like this big-titted blonde woman is the image of what an American woman should be. And then you go out in the streets, how many Sydney Sweeneys do you see walking around? Obviously, when they say Germany was run by a bunch of hypocrites because they didn't bring in people with blonde hair and blue eyes, well, not every German had those features. There's an ideal German. Just like today in America, American media, there's an ideal like woman. I guess today it's like a man who's pregnant, but there used to be like an ideal woman. It's like over here in Japan, like the idol culture. There's like an ideal certain idol look. Not everybody looks like that. They weren't hypocrites. That was just the image. But they were obsessed with race. Says the people that literally think they were chosen by God and given a special form of genetics that is like impervious to disease like COVID-19, that they're unique and special and have a right to rule the world. I see my friend in the chat, Goey, he said at one time there was talk of a plan to relocate them to Madagascar, but it was either deemed impractical or too costly. And he's right, there was a plan to do that. Instead, they decided to distribute them over the territories that I just showed you on the Yad Vashem website. Hey, for the record, whether you agree with this or you disagree with this, I am equally as surprised learning about all of this stuff. When I first learned about it, I was equally surprised. I had no idea. I really didn't. I mean, I knew a lot of things, but some of the specifics here, I did not know. I knew about the conference. I didn't know about the specifics of like if I actually sit down and read it, the minutes of it, where it explicitly just, it says like, this is the final solution. And then I've been told, because I've been told my whole life in advanced placement history, murder Jews, murder Jews, murder Jews. Then we read, there was no plan to murder Jews. Even after the 40s began, there was no plan to murder Jews. The final solution wasn't a plan to murder Jews. Where was this stuff coming from? Jewish propaganda. The same propaganda that rallied tens of thousands of Americans to a cause that they didn't care about, didn't know anything about, what weren't aware of, but they were brought to care about it through sympathetic, emotional-driven Jewish media and the Jewish control over certain local political systems and over the law enforcement apparatuses as well. And that's how they got the public concerned about what was happening in Germany to boycott and protest. And when Goebbels had seen that, he said, you are going to get it now. And of course, they only show you the part where Goebbels says, you're going to get it now. I mean, it's like if you were just dishonestly clipping something out of context. You know, AIPAC and the ADL do this with podcasters and radio hosts and even they even do this with like documentaries and stuff. They just take things completely out of context. They just cut these things up real fast. So you get 30 seconds of people saying things out of context. If you were to have a conversation with somebody, it works just like this. And you said, you know, I really don't want to kill a group of people. But they just cut out the don't want or the don't, and then they play it back. I, and cuts, want to kill this group of people. That's how dishonest this is. It's dishonest about the protests and the boycotts. Not to mention, by the way, the Night of Broken Glass was a result of Germans, not the German government, but the German people rebelling and rioting against the assassination of a German diplomat who was murdered in cold blood by a psychotic Jewish terrorist. Don't believe me? Look it up. All the things that we were told, there's no reason for the things that happened. Anti-Semitism was just naturally a problem. There's no even definition of what it is, except later, after the fact, it was defined as people that just didn't like Jews controlling everything. The same thing was happening in Russia under Catherine the Great, which is why they shut up the Pale of Settlement, and various czars as well after her, leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1718. And yes, people talk about the Red Cross. I see somebody in the chat has mentioned the Red Cross. This is wild too. If you looked at the Red Cross, like, it is really well documented. It's like when people talk about the protocols of I almost said the protocols of Goyim, the protocols of Zion, and they just mock it, make fun of it. The same thing people make fun of and mock the Talmud, like, oh, you think there's stuff in the Talmud? This isn't in the Talmud. Jesus isn't burning in feces. But if you go read it, you can actually find those segments, whether they're in or out of context. I have a whole section in my new book on the Red Cross and the Arlson archives, and how there's actually more survivors today than there ever has been in the past of the Holocaust. If you go and look at the Red Cross, it is actually really shocking. Here's the 271,000 death total. Most of that was starvation. That was toward the end of the war. Disease, primarily exposure to the elements. These were labor facilities. Nothing unique or interesting about it. Here is another document from the Red Cross. Our delegate told us that he had not been able to discover any trace of installations for exterminating civilian prisoners. They must have hidden those too. Here's the, this is a German document with a list of prisoners. There's your totals. A couple 100,000. Here are some screenshots, Holocaust Encyclopedia. This is from my book. No, when the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, they did not immediately start to carry out the mass murder of Jews. Turns out they actually didn't plan on that at all. I found this also interesting. This is this U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. With the establishment of Israel in 1948, this is the anniversary, by the way, May, Jewish refugees began streaming into the new sovereign state. Some 140,000 Holocaust survivors entered Israel during the next few years. The United States had been 400,000 displaced persons between 1945 and 1952. Approximately 96,000, 24% of them were Jews who had survived the Holocaust. How do those numbers work out? If everybody was killed, Norman Finkelstein, who I don't agree with on everything, but he's, I think, a pretty honest Jewish guy. He wrote The Holocaust Industry. Norman Finkelstein said, kind of jokingly, that his mother used to ask the question, who did Hitler actually kill? Because not only were there just hundreds of thousands of Jews that survived and went into to Israel and went into America, but if you look at these headlines today, here's Time Magazine, 100,000 Holocaust survivors, 2016. Here's the Jerusalem Post, 2020. 192,000 Holocaust survivors living in Israel alone. How are there more Holocaust survivors living in Israel alone than there are in the entire world? That doesn't make any sense. Here's the Associated Press. 80 years after the Holocaust, 245,000 Jewish survivors are still alive. How do you get these? They're literally multiplying. Not only was Hitler discriminate, but it appears that there's actually more Jews today. Like Hitler actually gave birth to more Jews. It seems like he birthed 6 million, didn't murder 6 million. How do you get to these numbers? Here's a recent claims conference report. This is on the material claims against Germany. I actually learned about this initially from Norman Finkelstein, and then recently I had dug this particular story up myself, this document. You could just type this in. You could type in demographic report, 220,800 Holocaust survivors alive globally. I guess it dropped a little bit from the AP article, but we're still over 200,000. And here's what the report says. They have these little images here. There's a whole bunch of them in the document. I pulled these from my book. 96% of this number are child survivors who were born between 1928 and 1946, meaning that the vast majority of the 220,000 were children. Children that could have been born in 1946. In 1946, let's put this into context. This means that if the war ended in 1945, if you were born a year after the war ended, you were still considered a Holocaust survivor. How does that work? How does it work if Auschwitz was liberated? It was in January, which it would have been snowing, of 1945. If you were born a year after Auschwitz was liberated, you are still a Holocaust survivor. 87 years is the median age for these Holocaust survivors. 70 to 100 plus is the age of the current population of Holocaust survivors, which means that literally, if you were in the Holocaust, you actually have a longer average lifespan than the general public. I'm going to say that again. The average American lifespan, and we're one of the richest, wealthiest countries in the world, the average American lifespan is 72 years old. This means if you are a Jew who survived the Holocaust, who went through all these horrible things, you literally have an average lifespan 6 years at minimum, 28 years at maximum, above the lifespan of Americans who never experienced the Holocaust. How does that work? See, when they define these terms, you learn that it's fake. It's not real. It is a fictional story. When you define these terms, you realize the whole narrative is a fabrication. It's not real. It's fake. And what is happening today is a reinvention of this narrative. There's a second Holocaust coming. It's really just people that don't like Jews. You want to talk about real cases of fake stories? This has been known forever. Recently, it's gained more and more traction. I collected these articles from my book in a section called Surviving the Lies, Show Me the Money. Show is a term that means, it's the Jewish Holocaust. Here's the New York Times. Herman Rosenblatt, 85, dies. Made up Holocaust love story. You're telling me that famous Oprah Winfrey inspired Holocaust love story of meeting his wife around some barbed wire, that wasn't real? That was fake? No. Here's another one. Man who claimed he escaped Auschwitz admits story is a lie. Oops. Here's another one. New York Times. He was a prominent Holocaust survivor, but his story was a hoax. Here's another one. Fraudulent Holocaust memorist must return $22.5 million to publisher. Turns out this woman, I think this is the one where she claims that she hold on a second. Yeah, I think she claimed that she was like a survivor. Oh, yeah. This is Misha. Who, by the way, wasn't even officially Jewish. She claimed that she wandered through war-torn Europe at the age of 7 in search of her deported, not murdered, her deported parents who got chalked up in the 6 million. On the journey, she claims to have lived with a pack of wolves. I'm not joking. Secretly infiltrated the Warsaw Ghetto. I'm not joking. And snuck up on and murdered a Nazi soldier. All of this while she was documented to be in grammar school, and she had to pay back all the money she stole. Not to mention people like Eli Wiesel, who I call a lying weasel. That's what he is. who has told so many fabrications, I wouldn't even trust this guy to tell me what planet he's on. He is a lying scumbag. Here's one of the things that he wrote in the book Night, which, by the way, this is all sort of ignored and dismissed because it's so obviously nonsense. This is one of the original Holocaust narratives that just didn't stick, and they've kind of done away with it. Here it is. Not far from us, flames were leaping from a ditch, gigantic flames. They were burning something. A lorry drew up at the pit and delivered its load. Little children, babies. Yes, I saw it with my own eyes. Those children in the flames. Accusing the Germans of murdering babies in open fire pits when that's what the Jews have been accused of since biblical times. All projectionism. Oh, and then this great line here. In Buchenwald, this was the prisoner camp where they sent the communists. They sent 10,000 persons to their death each day. I was always... Listen to this. He wrote this. I was always in the last 100 near the gate. They stopped. Why? He survived every single time. You'd think that they got through to the last 100. They put them in the front the next day. But no, he always got put in the back so he could witness it and write a book about it. It's total bullshit. And I use Hiroshima as an example, Nagasaki as an example. There's the famous, or maybe famous, Shimoda case where stories of Holocaust survivors, real ones in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were told to the government. The argument was that what was done was illegal, and after the war, the Japanese citizens basically had their rights waived by force by the U.S. and this is you get famous legal case because Japan waived all claims, against the Allied powers. And when you read that, that's like the only main big documented case of people saying, hey, we want some kind of reparations for what happened, legitimate ones. And I've told the story of a Yamaguchi-san who survived both the Holocaust of Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombing. He went to work, and then he went home, and then he got bombed again. He is a name you probably never heard of. And you probably never heard of him because the Japanese don't run around talking about how they survived Holocausts and telling everybody today that they are Holocaust survivors and demanding money. And they don't demand this and make movies about it and TV shows about it and put up museums and just it's everywhere you look. They don't do that because, well, there's a lot of reasons why. One of the main reasons is probably because there's no industry for it. And there is a Holocaust industry because it's big business for bankers. It's big business for war profiteers. It's big business for museums. It's big business for schools. And it's big business for the Jews that run all that in the media and Hollywood. It's a lie. And the people that run Hollywood that make their living off of fake stories, I'm supposed to believe when they tell me first, second, third, fourth hand, 50, 60, 70 years later from what happened in the past, that something happened that was so horrible, but they can't show me evidence. And then when we actually have evidence, it's not actually evidence. It was all a code. They've made this such a taboo topic that even hearing me talk about this, even showing the evidence, I know it's going to turn people off and he's just an anti-Semite. Well, okay. I'm just an anti-Semite. Let me end with this. This is former Israeli prime minister, or not prime minister, Israeli minister of education. She's also the founder of a conservative party, or more like a progressive kind of Jewish conservative, progressive. I think it's called RATS. Funny enough, it's called RATS. Jewish, I guess it's like a liberal. I say conservative because I've always seen it as like conservative for Jewish, values, but it's progressive, politically speaking. This is what she had to say. I think that this was on Democracy Now! Or something. Listen to what she had to say, and this pretty much summarizes the show, and we'll end with this. Take a listen to this.
Often when there is dissent expressed in the United States against policies of the Israeli government, people here are called anti-Semitic. What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew?
Well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And the organization is strong and has a lot of money. And the the ties between Israel and the American Jewish establishment are very strong, and they are strong in this country.
Did you get that? There's more to it, but the really important part is her initial response
to that as an Israeli Jew.
Well, it's a trick. We always use it.
It's a trick. We always use it. It's a trick. We call you a Holocaust denier. We call you an anti-Semite. Why are we still talking about these terms and words that have no meaning? It's like it's Marxist. Why are we talking about this? Call me an anti-Semite. I don't give a shit. Call me a Holocaust denier. Fuck you. I don't give a shit. Facts are what they are. And if you want to stop bad things from happening, you're going to need to recognize this now because we are on the ledge. The Pogroms' progress is proceeding globally. And it's not going to turn out well for anybody. Because the more these people are exposed for what they do, the more that they abuse and murder their own people, the control of the media, the control of political institutions, the blackmail, the corruption, the control of militaries like the United States military, we will have a global world war before these people lift a single finger off of their death grip on the wealth and the power that exists in the world. And the thing is, ultimately, I'm trying to avoid these outcomes. I don't want to get to that point. But based on history, I'll agree with Adolf Hitler when he said these people seem to have been specially selected by nature to fulfill this role. Maybe it's because they murdered their Messiah. And I'm not even a Christian, and I guess I could make that argument. A cursed people, if you will. tstradio.info, rdgable@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for tuning into the show tonight. I really appreciate it. You can obviously tell that this is a very different kind of a show. And yes, I don't argue. Someone said earlier, I don't argue for white people. I don't know what white people are. I define people by culture more so, or very obvious identifying features. Like, I'm not really white. I'm more like my skin's very red. I don't really think this is white. And I think that's largely a Jewish op too. Whites, separate them from the blacks and the Indians, the blacks and the Indians and the Muslims and the Arabs. And that's all that undermining of culture like they're trying to do here in Japan as well. So please buy me a coffee. Please subscribe to the show. Please support the show in whatever way you can. tstradio.info, rdgable@yahoo.com. I want to thank all of you in the chat tonight. There's too many people to mention by name, but you are all on the screen. You have been the whole time on the little chat box there. I appreciate the support. Links are below. However you're listening to the show tonight, thank you. If you'd like to get the ad-free version of the show, please subscribe at, again, tstradio.in. Again, that is the Pogroms' Progress. Thank you for tuning in. I will talk to you on the next broadcast. Have a great night. And for those of you on YouTube, the music is White Bat Audio. You can find them on YouTube, White Bat Audio. Have a great night.